Mr. Jones, if you're in your team ready? Guess we're ready. Okay, great. I'm going to start this off. It's going to take me a little bit, and then we'll get going. So I'm going to call item number 9, hearing on the application of Jon Jones for issuance of a license to engage in unarmed combat, to include discussion and deliberation regarding Jon Jones, United States Anti-Doping Agency in competition and out of competition anti-doping drug testing results. Some of you may have seen me walk up to Mr. Jones prior to this hearing, so I want to make sure it's clear to all of you what I told him. Number 1 is I'm happy he's here. It's a good step forward for him to appear. And number 2 is I told him to just relax. Not to relax because he's approved or unapproved, but to relax because today is going to take some time. And I wanted to assure him that he is going to be treated with the utmost respect in this hearing. Not all prior hearings of this commission have gone that way, and I will not tolerate any roughness, for lack of a better word, with our applicant. So, and I know that my commissioners feel the same way. This will be a respectful hearing. We're going to hear a lot of testimony. We're going to have a lot of dialogue, and at the end we will conclude whatever the Nevada Athletic Commission feels comfortable. Just to make sure that that information is on the record. So Mr. Jones, I reiterate that to you. Take a deep breath, relax. I'm glad you're here, and I look forward to getting through this. Before we get started, I do want to make a brief statement. So, and I don't have it written down. It's kind of in my mind, and it's kind of in my heart. I want it to be known as we led up to the fight and the results that came out, and in trying to work through your fight and your fight night, that I have been here now, I think approximately 5 or 6 years, and I won't say I've seen it all, but I've seen a lot. And this is a case like I've never seen. And there have been times, honestly speaking from my heart to all of you, that I've woke up the next morning after walking out of this commission meeting and felt, I don't know if I did the right thing. I guide my entire life on trying to do the right thing. And I know that Executive Director Bennett and the other commissioners here feel the same way. And the one thing that I will never sacrifice as chairman of this commission or as a commissioner is the integrity of this commission under any circumstance. However, your case is an anomaly. And the decision that we made to allow California to take this was one that was done out of conscience, not out of regulation. If we would have followed the regulation, and I do want to commend Executive Director Bennett in a way that he's probably never been commended by me as we were going through these discussions. If we would have just followed the book and not listened to a few of the expert witnesses that I understand are here today that we put the utmost trust in, your career would be over. You would be looking at a third offense and 18 months to life, and I would venture to say it would be a lot closer to life than it would be 18 months. And when we made that decision that Friday, the 21st, after hours and hours and hours of trying to understand this, it was one that said, we need to pause here for a minute. I don't have enough information. I do not understand this. I'm not going to allow this fight in the state of Nevada, and Executive Director Bennett and I completely concurred. But at the same time, I'm not going to ruin this man's career. And so here we are today. The decisions that were made after that evening were decisions that were made outside of our purview and our jurisdiction. We have no interest in those decisions. I don't care about those decisions. They're not my business. They're somebody else's, and they're yours in another state. And frankly, we felt, I think, reasonably more comfortable that that state had a much better understanding of what was going on with you and your, I'll call it, passport. And that leads me to the last thing. The only reason that we're here today, whether you buy into the fact that USADA is good or bad and it's year-round, in and out of competition testing for the UFC, when that idea first came to this commission approximately 3 years ago, the whole idea of it was to self-regulate with regulators monitoring your self-regulation. The second biggest part of it was to develop a passport on every fighter in the UFC. If you did not have that passport today, we would not be having this hearing, because we would not have those results over the last 2 years. And I think it's important for people to note that that was the whole idea, was to develop a path, a science, a history on each individual body over a long period of time, each individual fighter over a long period of time. I'm not by any means saying that that system is perfect. I think there's still flaws in it. I think there's still things that need to be worked out. I think we have communication gaps between USADA, the commissions, etc. And it's also clear to note for people that what USADA's adjudication process internally has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on how the Nevada Athletic Commission feels about each individual case. And what we have said in the past is we will watch those adjudications, and we have followed this. If we're comfortable with those adjudications, then there's no reason to hear the case twice. We let the self-regulation do its job, and we move on. This is a particular case where we have a licensee now that's coming before us that has a passport. There's some science that we need to understand and digest today, and we'll move forward. So that's my opening statement to everybody. I appreciate everybody making the effort on short notice to get here. I wanted you to understand how we got to today. And so what I would like to ask of the applicant is, how many people do you have on your behalf today that you would like to speak?
When you say on our behalf, I mean, we have Mr. Jones and myself. I mean, we'd like to have testimony from Dr. Eichner and Dr. Fedoruk. They're certainly not our witnesses in that sense. Beyond that, I don't think we have...
There are no witnesses here today. There's just testimony on behalf of the medical, the science part of this.
Sure.
This is not an adjudication hearing, it's a licensing hearing. So we obviously have this issue, which we all understand is the M3 metabolite from oral turinabol, and the idea of what I'm going to call residual, or all these different words that have been used, but I'm going to use the term residual. So I want to know, because I want to try to structure the hearing in a way that makes sense, where you have the ability, and I first would turn it over to you and your client to make any statements that you would like. Second, what I would like to do is I would like to bring forward any expert witnesses, which we all want to hear from, and have the ability for them to either make a statement, and then this commission has a tremendous amount of questions for them.
Okay.
And then third, any recommendations you have on how you would like to see this structured.
Sure. I'd like to do an opening statement with your permission.
Yes.
And then I think it makes sense at that point to have Dr. Eichner, since he's here in person, be the next person to speak. I'd like to ask him some questions, but I'm happy to defer to the commission to ask questions first if that's what you prefer. And I could always step in and ask him. I'm prepared for anything today. So we just want to make sure we do everything the commission wants us to do so that you leave today with enough information to feel like you can make a decision. So, and then we have Dr. Matthew Fedoruk as well on the phone from London, who's available to testify after Dr. Eichner.
Is Mr. Cook here from USADA as well?
Mr. Cook is here as well.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, that would work. We'll let you do an opening statement. Then we'll bring forward each of the, I would say, Dr. Eichner, Dr. Fedoruk, and potentially Mr. Cook from USADA. We'll let the commission ask its questions first, and then give you the opportunity to ask questions to fill in any gaps that you think we have missed, or to make your point versus the point that may be being made up here.
The only other point to address is Mr. Jones, in terms of him making a statement. We're certainly happy to make a statement. I think it's important for him to explain to you why he wants to fight in Nevada. That's something he made clear to me last night. It's a different type of place to fight than anywhere else. So I can have him make that statement in the beginning or in the end, however you prefer.
It's totally up to you.
Okay. Well, why don't I give an opening statement, and then you'll hear from Mr. Jones, and then we can have Dr. Eichner come forward.
That's fine. The only other thing I would need to ask is, so the first thing I need to do is I'm going to take item number 9 and all of the information that you submitted to us and admitted into evidence, so it's on our record.
Okay.
Second thing I'd like to do is, of the people that you've identified, do we need to swear any of these people in?
That's at your discretion, Chairman.
I'd like to do that. So anybody that's here in person, I believe it would be Dr. Eichner, and Mr. Cook from USADA.
Mhm.
Is that correct? Are they here?
Yes.
Can you guys just come up here real quick, and then we'll let you sit down. Mr. Jones, you also are going to be providing information as well. Would you mind swearing in the three, and then the gentleman on the phone? I guess.
I don't believe Dr. Fedoruk's on the phone yet. I think
He's not. Okay.
He's available and ready to be on the phone when we need him.
Okay, if we need him when we get to him.
Sure.
So I would let you go ahead and swear these witnesses in, please.
All right, gentlemen, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Okay, great. I'll turn it over to you. Real quick, does that satisfy you, Mr. Detmer, about procedure and the way we're going to go about this?
Yes, Chairman.
Okay, great. Turn it over to you.
Good morning.
Please state your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Paul Green on behalf of Jon Jones here today in Mr. Jones's licensing reissuing hearing. I just want to thank Mr. Bennett and the Commission for allowing Mr. Jones this opportunity today. I know how much it means to him to have the opportunity again to fight in the state of Nevada. He is currently scheduled to fight on March 2nd. I don't think that's a secret. It's been announced here in Las Vegas, and defend his UFC light heavyweight title against Anthony Smith. Mr. Jones filed a submission, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, on Friday in advance of today's hearing, along with a list of exhibits 1 to 11, and a list of anticipated witnesses. The idea behind filing the submission in advance was so that the Commission could have all the science in its hands before the hearing, and hopefully that was allowed everyone to better understand what is a complicated issue. Obviously, Mr. Jones is here today with the hope that the Commission will rely on the science detailed in the submission that the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency relied upon in determining in December that Mr. Jones has not committed an anti-doping rule violation since July 2017, which is a violation for which he's already been punished. The science that the California State Athletic Commission relied on, and I understand that that's a different jurisdiction, but we believe it's relevant nonetheless in the sense that they reissued his license relying on the same science. And of course, he fought on December 29th against Alexander Gustafsson and recaptured the light heavyweight championship in Inglewood. Mr. Jones believes that it would only be fair to have his license reinstated because this continuing presence of picogram levels of what is known by anti-doping scientists as the chairman referenced the M3 metabolite in his urine. It remains unknown how long this stuff will stay in his urine, and it's possible he could continue to test the picogram levels for years to come through no fault of his own. Some dates to focus on today. July 28th, 2017. That's an important date. That's the time when Mr. Jones tested positive for the M3 long-term metabolite of the prohibited drug called oral turinabol. It was during his in-competition test following his bout in UFC 214. The amount measured was estimated at is an extraordinarily low level. It's 20 to 80 picograms, and what does that mean? A picogram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. I'm certainly not a scientist. Dr. Eichner can better explain what that means, but I've heard it referred to as a splash of salt in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's how little this amount is. September 18, 2018, renowned sports lawyer and arbitrator Richard McLaren issues a decision in Mr. Jones's case involving the July 28, 2017 positive. He sanctions Mr. Jones for 15 months for the M3 metabolite. And most importantly, Mr. McLaren determined there was absolutely no intent on Mr. Jones's part to use a prohibited substance. And in fact, USADA never took the position that there was any intent. That was never part of the hearing itself. The whole issue was whether or not he could get a reduction without showing source. And in fact, Mr. McLaren found that he could, reduced him to 15 months. He found that Mr. Jones was a truthful witness who recognized he could only improve by being an exemplary, drug-free fighter in the future. Mr. McLaren wrote of Mr. Jones that he needed the opportunity to regain his dignity and self-esteem by fighting again, recognizing that this is what Mr. Jones does, how he makes his living, how he identifies himself in the world, and as you'll hear from him, how important it is for him to once again fight in Las Vegas versus anywhere else. December 20, 2018, USADA notifies the Commission that it would not charge Mr. Jones with a new UFC anti-doping policy rule violation, notwithstanding the detection of the M3 metabolite in his urine on 3 separate occasions, One was August 29th, one was September 18th, and one was December 9th. In his letter to the commission, attorney Jeff Cook, who is here today, it's Exhibit 2 of the submission, wrote that the presence of the M3 metabolite was not consistent with re-administration of a prohibited substance, and this very low level would not result in any performance enhancement in relation to Mr. Jones's upcoming bout. Because USADA did not believe there was any reasonable basis to proceed with a new rule violation, USADA did not initiate proceedings under the UFC anti-doping policy. USADA's decision to not charge Mr. Jones with another anti-doping rule violation, despite the continued presence of the M3 metabolite at picogram levels, was based on the opinions of 3 world-renowned anti-doping experts, one of whom is here today, of course, Dr. Eichner, the president of the WADA-accredited laboratory in Salt Lake City, the Sports Medicine Research and Testing Laboratory known as SMERTL. He will testify in person, and well, he will be here in person to speak to the commission. His December 20th opinion letter is Exhibit 3. Dr. Larry Bowers was the second world-renowned anti-doping expert. He's the former chief science officer for USADA. He unfortunately could not be here today. His opinion letter from December 20th is Exhibit 4 of Mr. Jones's submission. And Dr. Matthew Fedoruk, USADA's current chief science officer, who's also able to testify, as we had said, by phone. He did not file anything in writing, but he can explain to you the basis of his opinion by phone today. Dr. Eichner's opinion in sum was, there's no evidence that olterinibol, also known as DHCMT, was re-administered after July 28, 2017, and this would include the period from October of 2017 to August of 2018, when there was no testing done by USADA through no fault of Mr. Jones's doing. He just wasn't tested. But there's no evidence in that period, as Dr. Eichner said in that letter, and he can reiterate again today, that there was any use in that period. It's just that he wasn't tested. He believed that the amount was residual from prior to July 28, 2017, primarily because there was only this long-term metabolite detected. There was no short-term metabolite or parent compound. And if there had been re-administration, there would have been evidence of both, the parent and the short-term. And also, his first test back on August 9th was negative. And perhaps you can ask Dr. Eichner if that test had been different. If that first test had been positive, he might have a different opinion. The M3 metabolite remained in Mr. Jones' body, and it's been described as pulsing or coming out somehow. Not 100% sure myself on the science here, and I look forward to Dr. Eichner explaining it. But somehow it stays in your body, and it comes out in different ways. One of the theories is that it comes out when you drop weight, which would explain why on December 28th, the day he weighed in, he was negative. I mean, he was positive. Sorry, the next day, on the 29th, he was negative. So a fourth world-renowned anti-doping science expert, Dr. Brian Ahrens, who heads the other WADA-accredited lab in the US, and there are only 2, SMERTL and UCLA. He heads the UCLA lab, told the California State Athletic Commission he agreed with Dr. Eichner and Dr. Bowers and Dr. Fedoruk, and that's at Exhibit 10. So we have the 2 directors of the 2 WADA-accredited laboratories in the United States, the current and former chief science officer at USADA, as the 4 scientific opinions were saying, Jon Jones did not take this again, and he shouldn't be continued to be punished or denied the opportunity to fight based upon this continued presence of the M3 metabolite. And because there's uniform agreement that this level, which is a trillionth smaller than a gram, is the result of re-administration, Mr. Jones hopes Nevada will follow California's lead and accept these findings. He obviously is here today hoping that his license is reissued today. And I think it's important to understand the opinion of these 4 scientists is that there's no way he could gain any performance-enhancing advantage by the presence of this picogram level. So let's say he tests positive again on March 1. When I say test positive, I mean the presence is still there at this picogram level. The night before this fight or the night of the fight, there would still be no performance-enhancing advantage. And as far as our proposal, we would propose what we agreed to with California, which is in essence that as long as Dr. Eichner or whoever we wanted to agree upon as an expert would look at the results and say this is still a continued presence in that re-administration, it would not be viewed as as an additional anti-doping rule violation. That's the position California is taking, and we believe it's a reasonable position to take in light of the science that's being put forth. Obviously, we're prepared to answer any questions regarding the submission. Before I call Mr. Jones, I'm happy to do that if you think it would help.
Are there any questions from any commissioners on the opening statement from, it's Mr. Green, correct?
Yes.
From Mr. Green? I will let you proceed.
Mr. Jones, you're under oath. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and you can just look at the commission. And again, we're not in an adversarial hearing today, so just be yourself, despite the fact that there's a billion cameras around.
Yeah, you're going to have to speak up.
Okay.
You might have to move the microphone
Sure.
to the middle without pulling it out. Oh, perfect.
So the first thing, John, just to be clear, at any point in your life, did you ever intentionally take oral turinabol?
No.
Do you have any idea how this stuff ever got into your body?
No.
Why are you here today wanting to fight in Nevada? When you have your license in California, you've already fought in California, why is Nevada so important for you?
Fighting in Nevada is extremely important to me. I believe it's the fight echo of the world. One of my personal goals since day one has been to just be like a mainstream athlete, catapult the sport, bring more awareness to mixed martial arts. And I think doing that, being able to fight in Las Vegas is obviously going to help me do that. People in Nevada love mixed martial arts. They're some of our most loyal fans. And I just think it'd be really sad to not give the fans what they want, just be a part of, all that.
You've already agreed to voluntary testing as part of your agreement with California. Would you agree to continue to be tested voluntarily if the Nevada Commission wanted to do that too?
Absolutely.
Any questions for Mr. Jones?
I'll let you finish.
I think that's all we want to say.
Okay. Are there any questions from any of the commissioners of Mr. Jones at this time? If you don't ask them at this time, it does not mean that's your last chance to ask Mr. Jones any questions. I think we'll certainly conclude with Mr. Green and Mr. Jones after we get through the experts that will be called forward. So if you're not ready, that's fine. And if you are ready, please ask.
And I will ask Mr. Green, because it was included in your opening statement and the submission that is now in evidence. I guess I'm cautious to hear the words "through no fault of his own." And while it's never been proven, confirmed, at some point an illegal substance got into Mr. Jones' system.
Can I clarify what I meant there?
Yes, please.
What I meant was that it continues to be in his system now through no fault of his own, meaning this is not a typical substance, a substance that remains in your system for almost 2 years after it was initially ingested, whenever that was, prior to July 2017. That's what I meant to clarify. I should have probably written it more clearly. But I didn't mean that there was no fault initially, and certainly John would tell you he was at fault for what happened. I don't think anyone's trying to say that he didn't make a mistake initially.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Appreciate the clarification.
Could you just expand on that last comment about making a mistake initially? Because I'm under the impression that there is no source.
Well, I'm not saying a specific mistake. I mean, whatever happened, we don't know where it came from. I mean, we tested all the supplements, and we just don't know what happened. But what I mean is, John, I mean, every athlete who ultimately tests positive for something has to take responsibility for that, and that's part of the strict liability standard. So that's whether he intended to do it or not, which he clearly did not. It's still his fault that it somehow ended up in the system.
Thank you. Thanks for clarification.
Mr. Hall, to me, that's one of the problems. This is not a standard problem because it's a black market drug. And so there aren't enough tests that have been done to, define its purposes, how long it lasts, and that's the problem, that we're having, obviously, and John obviously is the victim of it. But it's not a standard doping violation that we can go and say, hey, this is, this is prohibited. So this is, it's backed our asses right in the corner. And you too, and John, I hear you loud and clear. I mean, you're a hell of an athlete, but there's nothing standard about this
I think that's right, and certainly Dr. Eichner could testify a lot better than me. My degree was certainly not in anything close to his, so I was a lawyer. I did not do very well in science, so I went to law school. I think he's the better one to answer those questions than me.
Okay, I only have one question, and I think it would, and then I think it would be appropriate to move on to Dr. Eichner's testimony or statements, and can answer probably a lot of the questions that we have. But Mr. Jones, from what I've gathered here, and I'm summarizing, that you have at times throughout your career taken tremendous amount of supplements. I think I read 14 that was going on, but you had a nutritionist, you were monitoring those. Since the oral Turinabol long-term metabolite M3 has been showing up here, in the last 90 days, 180 days, do you have a current supplement list that you are taking?
Yes, I do.
You do. So you're still taking some supplements, approved supplements. What? And I don't want to know what they are, but about how many are you currently taking?
I'm currently about 4.
So you're down to 4.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I can represent that they're all certified supplements now, so making sure of that.
And when you say certified, is that because it's approved on the list, or are you actually taking the supplement, having it tested before he starts taking that specific lot?
Yeah, they're NSF certified or batch tested. I'm not sure if it's NSF or Informed Sport, but one of the batch testing supplement. I mean, I don't know if anyone anywhere is testing all their supplements in a lab before they're taking them. As far as I know,
And nobody else is dealing with this issue, so.
True, but as far as I know, and he is not the only athlete dealing with it, but there are others in different sports. But as far as I know, there's never been a positive test in any of the professional sports who all give their athletes third-party batch tested supplements. So I think it's about as safe as you can do.
Yeah, the supplements I take are mainly for neuron like rejuvenation, like brain health type of things.
Okay.
Omegas and things like that. Very generic.
Okay, great. Well then, if you're ready to call Dr. Eichner, I think it would be so appropriate to call Dr. Eichner, and maybe if it's fine with you, Mr. Jones can take a back seat. So, sure. Because Mr. Eichner might be standing here a while, and I'd like him to be able to be comfortable. And if we need to have Mr. Jones come back forward, we can.
You want Dr. Eichner to sit here?
That'd be great.
Okay.
Morning, Dr. Eichner.
Good morning.
Can you just give your name for the record, please?
Daniel Eichner.
Wonderful, thank you. I would turn it over to you if you'd have any opening statements you'd like to make. You've obviously been involved with this from, back in December. And if you do not, then I'm going to open it up for the commission to start going through some questions. But I would like to allow you the opportunity to make a statement in case you want to lay any groundwork or framework about what we're discussing here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have nothing prepared. I'm here on behalf of to try to assist with this program, and want to make it very clear that I have no horse in this race. I'm here to be truthful and honest and try to walk through what we do know and what we don't understand about DHCMT or oral Turinabol.
That's great, and after working with you for the time that I have, as well as Executive Director Bennett, I wouldn't expect anything less from you. So I appreciate you making the time and the effort to get here. I know you have an unbelievably busy schedule, and you're a very sought-after individual as it pertains to the world of anti-doping. So thank you for being here. So with that, I would turn it over to any of the commissioners to start asking some questions. I would just ask, we'll just be respectful of each other, and is anybody that'd like to go first? Dr. McBeth, would you like to start us off? So let you start off, and let's try not to ask the same question twice, but if we need some clarification, then we'll go from there.
Well, good morning, Dr. Eichner, and thank you very much for coming and testifying and helping us figure this out. And also, thank you for all of your lifetime work in this area, and I've read some of your studies and great contributions. So I think it would be helpful for the commission if we kind of asked a few basic questions first and kind of level set things. So I thought we could start with your with the lab, SMRTL, and how the lab is currently going about testing for the anabolic steroid, DHCT anabolic steroid, otherwise known as Turinabol. What is the metabolites that you're checking? How many of them? Let's start with that question.
Sure, thank you very much. We have learned a lot about how to detect oral Turinabol better in the last 4 or 5 years. And so with the identification of what we've been deeming as long-term metabolites, and the most common one that everyone is talking about is the M3 metabolite. Some labs will call it the M4, but the M3 is probably the best way to define it. That's a relatively new metabolite that's been identified. Importantly, when that was identified in the paper through the Moscow lab, through Sobolevsky and Rodchenkov, what their study intended to do was identify the longest term metabolites for oral Turinabol. And importantly, the study did not look at how long those metabolites were detected in urine. And so that's a very important piece to understand with detection, is that we know now what a very good long-term metabolites are. However, we don't have an exact time frame on how long they can be detected. And so the World Anti-Doping Agency will accredit laboratories around the world. I believe there's about 30 throughout the world, 2 in USA and 1 in Canada, so 3 in North America total. No lab does it exactly the same way. So some labs will look for the parent compound, which is indicative of very recent use. They will all look for the M3, which is right now known to be the longest lived metabolite. And then there's some short-term and intermediate metabolites that can also be detected, but again, some of these ones are recently identified, and when we're dealing with a drug that hasn't been FDA approved, you can't get ethical approval to do the necessary studies to actually work out what the detection window is on some of these in urine. So, you know, to answer your question, not all labs are looking for all the different analytes for oral Turinabol, but everyone should be looking for at least the parent and the M3 metabolite.
To that point, are the 3 North American WADA certified labs all testing for the short and midterm metabolite in addition to M3?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, and the purpose of testing for multiple metabolites in a sample?
So the laboratory, again, receives samples totally de-identified. We just get numbers. We have no idea who they come from. And our job in different programs we work through, the Olympic movement and through professional sports, law enforcement and other programs, is to offer our clients the best way of detecting someone who's abusing drugs. And so the parent and the short-term metabolites are great for identifying recent use, if they're getting an enhancement recently on those ones. And the M3 is a fantastic analyte for looking for someone who's ceased using a long time ago. And so the advantage of doing an array of metabolites, both very short-term, short or intermediate, and then long-term, is that we can then get a better idea on when someone might have used. And the best example would be if we see the parent compound coming in and we see the short and intermediate term metabolites, we know that's very recent and probably within several days of use. If we don't see parent, but we see other than short-term metabolites, then it might be a week or 2. And then if we go out and we only see the M3 metabolite, we know it hasn't been used for a while. And that's all we can pretty much say on that one.
So a question around the science on that, because I think it's important that we all have a good sense around the short and long term, that the parent short term and middle metabolites, as far as being confident that that we understand the maximum length of detection for those metabolites. We understand that there's confusion right now, or lack of science around this longer M3 metabolite. But could you make a comment around your confidence in the science around the short and midterm metabolites?
There is more data on the parent and the short-term metabolites purely because they've been tested for decades. So this isn't a new substance. It's been around for a long time, I believe developed by the East German doping machine, and so it's been around for decades. So there was a lot of data on the parent and the short-term metabolites purely because it's been tested for it in athletic samples for decades. And so there was a lot more known on how long those ones last, and they're relatively short-lived. That's why the identification of the long-term metabolites was such a great scientific discovery, because it changed from several days or a week to a lot longer.
Okay, so is it, as far as I can see in all of the test results, Mr. Jones has never tested positive for a parent short-term or long or intermediate-term metabolite. Is that your understanding?
Again, all the data that I've been provided for review, only the long-term M3 metabolite has been present. No other metabolites or analytes I've seen present in the data that's been presented to me.
Okay, so as a commissioner looking to ensure the safety of fighters in the ring, and I have a question for you with regards to the, I think it's Jones Exhibit number 3. It is your letter back to Mr. Cook, dated December 20th, 2018. And I think Mr. Green referenced it in his opening comments, which was the question Mr. Cook asked you, is the December 9th test result an indication of further additional exposure to DHCMT since the July 2017 adverse finding? And I'll just quote the response: there is no evidence that DHCMT has been re-administered. The most likely interpretation of these data is residual levels from previous exposure. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So when I looked at the actual dates of the tests that you supplied in this letter, I noticed that there was a actual 10-month period of time in which no testing of Mr. Jones took place, and I think that is between the test of October 11th of 2017 through August 9th of 2018. Is that correct?
I see that, yes.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, sorry, Doctor, is that the data was provided to me. We have no way to link all these data with an athlete. So the data was provided to me. We can't generate this ourselves, because if you look at the sample number on the second left column there, that's all we have. We don't have access to other laboratories, so if you look in the labs, you know, if it's come from a different lab other than Smyrtle, we don't have that data. And then also we would have no way to link it with any athlete. So importantly, this data was provided to me.
Okay, duly noted. So I'd like to ask the question just a little bit different. Could there have been a re-administration or re-ingestion of Turinabol at some point during the 10-month period where Mr. Jones was not tested, and still be consistent with the lab findings that were positive in August of 2018, September 2018, and December of 2018?
I mean, could there been any exposure during that period? Yes.
And still have, and the lab results, the positive lab results that we got, still be consistent with that re-exposure?
It would really depend upon whether, how much exposure or administration, the frequency of that as well. So there, I mean, you know, you're asking a great question, but there's so many caveats that I'd have to display for that answer, because without knowing how it was used, how often it was used, even the route of administration, all I could do is tell you, is it possible? Yes.
So it's possible to detect that, and it would be consistent with the lab tests that we had in August, September, and December.
And now you make me go through the caveats. So, you know, if I look at the data presented, and if we have a negative test towards the beginning of August in 2018. Well, I'm very confident it wasn't used recently before then. And so, you know, if you're then asking me, is it possible he had exposure, you know, closer to that October 2017 test, and will you still only see the M3 metabolite later? Sure.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to yield my time back to some of the other commissioners. I have a couple more questions for you, but let them have a chance.
I don't have any questions. I'd just like you to maybe clarify some framework, and then I'll turn it over back to my fellow commissioners, because it's something I've been trying to digest and understand since this happened. You say that we have a lot of information on oral turinabol and the shorter term or mid-term metabolites. One of the big questions for me is understanding that. Let's start off with ingestion of oral turinabol. From what I've been able to digest or read, that core compound substance, I'm not using the right words, is out of your system and undetectable how far from ingestion? Approximately, I'm not asking if you're definitives, but is it 2 days? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 10 days? About what is that?
And again, it would depend on the amount of exposure or administration and the frequency, but if you're looking at the parent compound, for example, we're probably talking days. And if we're looking at some of the short-term metabolites, we're talking a week or two. And as far as the intermediate metabolites go, we're in the same boat as we are with the M3, which is we don't know exactly.
Okay, so if I ingested the parent compound at some level, an approximation would be within a number of days the parent is gone. And let's just say it takes a week for the parent to be gone, and then it would take another 2 or 3 weeks, and the more mid-term, short-term metabolites are gone. Did I restate that correctly?
No, I think the parent and then the short-term would fit under that scenario, and then the intermediate metabolites would likely be detected longer. But you know, is it a few months or not? I'm not sure on that one.
Okay, that's helpful. And then as it pertains to the M3 metabolite, I think you stated this in the beginning, we have no idea. There's no science around how long that M3 metabolite can continue to show up.
I mean, I think saying no idea is a little harsh. We don't know exactly how long it is, but in the last 4 or 5 years, we've been involved in dozens of cases where we have longitudinal data on individuals. The important thing to remember is that these aren't controlled experiments where they're locked in a room and we know exactly what they're taking and not taking. But you know, through experience with other cases, looking at the longitudinal data, you know, there is definitely evidence that the M3 metabolite can be detected for a very long period of time.
And I believe in the study you referenced about the Germans and the doping and all that good stuff that I read on, it looked like in that study, I thought I recall seeing around 250 days is where the longest that was detected of the M3 metabolite. Am I recalling that correctly? Maybe we might get somebody else here today that would know that more.
If you can be a little more specific on which study you're talking about, I can probably help.
They only gave me 12, and I tried to read them all. I had no idea what I was reading, but I did the best that I could.
Okay, so and this is the Sobolevsky-Richenkov
Yes, sir.
study that was specifically looking to identify the long-term metabolites.
Yes, sir.
And so I know they did put some approximate days in here that they think could be detectable, but you know, fantastic research here. But you know, if we try to overinterpret any numbers out of here, I think you know we're doing a disservice to the study. It really was to identify the novel long-term metabolites, and the numbers they've given in here, and I believe it was 50 days they mentioned. We know that's not true.
I thought I read in that study, though, that there were some of the people that were tested that did go much further out than that. Maybe I'll look for that. But okay, I don't want to distract from my other commissioners. I'll turn it over to you guys, and I'll do some.
But maybe, Doctor, and let me start by saying thank you for willing to come and participate in this today. but maybe asking the chairman's question a different way, knowing that you just look at sample numbers and not individuals, and so over the last 4 or 5 years that you have been studying, what is the longest time period that it has been in the system from your sample studies? That's asked differently, maybe.
So one of my clients has been generous enough to let us discuss one of their matters that they've had, and we know of a case, and again, important to remember, these aren't controlled administration studies. We don't know exactly how much and the frequency they used. All we have is the data after they've been tested. And you know, there's cases where people have been tested 10 plus times per year, and it's still detectable, just the M3 metabolite, at varying, very low concentrations. So sometimes it's identifiable and sometimes it isn't, for well over 2 years.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going if it's okay with the other commissioners.
Please do.
Thanks. And at any time I ask you a question on behalf of Smyrtle that's more appropriate for Mr. Cook on behalf of USADA, please just let me know, because the lines were blurred as I was preparing my notes. I'm going to kind of step back a second like Dr. Macbeth did. During the, when this first broke, there was, I think, a lot of confusion whether the test results were atypical or adverse. And this is where I'm going to say maybe this is more Mr. Cook and not you, let me know. But I'd like to, I guess, start by understanding, based on reading the anti-doping policy on behalf of the UFC, at any time was any of Mr. Jones' tests considered atypical and then changed to adverse prior to release?
I can be very clear on that. Under the WADA code and the international standards for laboratory, atypical has a very specific defined definition, and at no time would any of these matters ever be considered atypical coming from the laboratory. I can't speak for policy through USADA or UFC, but as the laboratory is concerned, if the substance is confirmed at any concentration, it's an adverse finding. There's no wiggle room there. It can only be called that.
Thank you, sir. I'll have other questions for Mr. Cook then. Let me jump around. This may be getting off track a little bit, but are you aware of any other prohibited substance that has the potential for residual or pulsing outside of this M3 metabolite at this time?
Yes, and the reason why I'm laughing is that several years ago we had another substance called clomiphene. We had some anecdotal evidence through cases that the drug was acting in an unusual manner. And so specifically because it's an FDA-approved drug, we then did an administration study with clomiphene, and then we were able to track the subjects over time. So this is a controlled environment. We knew what they were using, what they weren't using, and we tested them out. And our hypothesis was correct. It acted most unusual, and no one expected it to be A, detectable in the urine for as long as it was, and B, showing some unusual fluctuations when it got down to low concentrations.
And I almost feel like this was the basic question, but the one that I don't have the answer to myself after reading everything. How does, or what is the scientific support that explains why or how the picogram levels can be higher? So obviously the December 9th testing at 82 picograms, than the July 2017 at 80 after so much time?
I mean, I can opine and give you some things that I think, but the studies haven't been done. So if we look at a drug, for example, like meldonium, it's a drug that was prohibited. It was recently put on the prohibited list, and it acted unusual in the fact that it had a very short half-life, although it was detected in urine for a long time. And the subsequent studies that came out of the Cologne laboratory identified that it was sequestered within the red blood cells. So if a red blood cells has a lifespan of about 100 days and then they die, or then the other red blood cells can pick up that drug again and it can keep going forward. So you can actually get meldonium, even with a short half-life, to be detectable for an awful long time in the urine. Well-established, great study that the Cologne lab did with clomiphene and DHCMT or oral turinabol. Those studies haven't been done. I mean, they've been attempted to be done, but they haven't shown. I suspect that it's sequestered somewhere in the body and then can come out later. And as far as you're concerned about fluctuations in concentration, you know, it doesn't act like a lot of the other drugs that we see. You know, if you inject nandrolone, for example, you know, that can be detected for over 12 months. But, you know, if you take specific gravity into account, the concentrations tend to go down over time, even though it's detected for an awful long period of time. Something like oral turinabol, we don't know what's getting sequestered, and so could it be in the fat cells, could it be in some other tissue? Once you get down to that low level, you do get a little bit of fluctuation, and we really see that without knowing the mechanism.
Thank you.
Doctor, most of the questions I have been asked already, but I'd like to know this, that on the findings of the M3, the word adverse, is it adverse finding of the M3 metabolite? What does adverse mean in terms of this report?
So again, it has a specific definition for the wider code of the International Standards for Laboratory. The common phrase would be positive. That would be the common name. You'd say this is positive for. M3 in our world we use as an adverse analytical finding. And, you know, importantly for us, it's an adverse analytical finding, and then the results management process takes over whether it's an anti-doping rule violation. Ours is very clear how we report it.
Thank you.
What's your opinion on the life cycle of the benefits of this drug? Time frame. Obviously, it stays there for 2 years. What's the time frame of the benefits, if any?
So again, you know, not fully knowing the mechanism of where it's sequestered and why it's detected for such a long period of time, and the fact that we're only seeing the M3 long-term metabolite coming out in these matters, you know, what biological function does that M3 metabolite have? Is it still able to offer an ergogenic aid? I mean, there's no data to support that it would. And so
that it would?
That it would.
At these levels?
That the M3 metabolite, excuse me, there's no evidence that the M3 metabolite is ergogenic. So it's a metabolite, it's a piece of the parent compound, and there's no evidence that it actually is performance enhancing in its own right. It's just a piece of the drug that's come out, and so we know that the drug has a window of detection of several days, and then it's broken up into metabolites that come out at later periods.
Thank you.
Just to expand on that, because this was one of my questions, I think that's a huge question of today's hearing, is I'm understanding this, and I'm not saying this is exact. I completely understand, for the record, that none of this is exact, but it's roundabouts, that the parent compound can be in your system for days, the short term, weeks, the two combined, possibly a month. What performance enhancing benefit does an athlete get from ingesting this drug? I think it would be first good to understand, we do know a lot about what oral turinabol does, and hear your take on why are people taking it, what is it doing? And then how long does that performance enhancement effect last? Because if it breaks down into a metabolite called M3 in about 30 days where there's no proof of performance enhancement, what did I gain in the 30 days that I took it?
So if you look at how steroids are usually cycled on and off, and again, these are used for non-therapeutic reasons. They're super physiological doses that the people that choose to take these things to try to get a benefit from, so they're taking a lot more than what a regular therapeutic dose would be. And I'm saying that generally speaking for anabolic androgenic steroids as opposed to oral turinabol specifically, but they tend to cycle on and off them, and so you know a typical cycle for a steroid like this would probably be 6 weeks, and so you know that would allow them to recover from heavy training periods, work out harder, so they could really train a lot harder with a less recovery period in between. And then if you're asking me how long do they maintain that benefit, well clearly when they stop, it starts titrating down where they don't maintain that benefit. You can't just do a 6-week cycle of steroids, build up to whatever physical level you want to get to, and then just maintain that workload without the drug and keep all those gains. It doesn't work like that. And so if you're asking me, you know, I can't give you an exact time period, but we're probably talking a few months after cessation.
And that's a key question, I think, for me in this, is that if I take oral turinabol, even assuming I took it for a 6-week cycle, then, and I stopped, performance-enhancing effect could possibly last a couple of months post the last ingestion. And then at that point, even though the M3 metabolite might show up sooner, or only the M3 metabolite might show up sooner, there still might be some benefit another month or two past that.
You know, I agree with everything you said until you said about the M3 still being around that is offering some kind of ergogenic aid. There's no evidence that that metabolite is performance enhancing. Clearly the parent is.
Understood. So I'm thinking about it in my mind, the way I think about things is kind of like a graph. You know, if I take oral turinabol on a 6-week basis, and I work out and I recover faster, I get stronger, I'm able to do more, which obviously gives me the benefit. And on day 45, I stopped taking oral turinabol. According to what we're talking about here, 1 month later, the only thing that will show up in my test results, if I said that wrong, would be the M3 metabolite. The oral turinabol and the short-term metabolites, and this is roundabout, would be gone, but I would still have a benefit that 30 days later. As I'm coming off of not being able to use this, the strength that I had built for that 6-week period is still there for me about 60 days later. And then at that point, I would be kind of back to normal.
I think that's fair, but the only thing that I would challenge you on is that
I'm not making statements, they're really questions.
No, sorry, Mr. Chairman, but is that I would argue that the intermediate metabolites that were identified in the Sobolevsky and Rychenkov paper would be detected for longer than a 4-week period. And so if you have, you know, 3 or 4 week period for the parent in the short term, and then you have the intermediate period that might be detectable for several months.
Okay.
And then only the M3 after that certain period of time. So you know, we've got a few month window. I think that's conservative, that we know if they've used within that 3-month period, just because we should see some of these intermediate metabolites.
So if we're not seeing the intermediate metabolite, and all we're seeing is the M3 metabolite, for a period of 6 months, is it safe to say that the athlete has no performance enhancing effect from the original ingestion?
I agree with that statement.
And you mentioned earlier that when he failed the July 28, 17 test, I think someone said how many days prior to that failed test had he ingested the drug? And you said, well, a while. So I understand that, but in your opinion, he has not ingested this drug since, not knowing when he took it, but you know for sure since July 28th of 2017 would be your professional opinion?
I think it's very important, you know, when I use the word that I see no evidence, and so I see no evidence of use after that. I mean, that's all I can really tell you, is that I've seen no evidence that it's been any exposure or administration after that.
Since the July 2017 failed test, and we don't know how many days prior to that he did take it.
Or how long he was taken for, or the route of administration.
Right. Since then,
that's correct.
In your opinion?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Just for the record, I think your statement was that the performance-enhancing benefit could last 3 months. I think the chairman was saying 60 days, so I just had to clarify that.
You know, I was trying to be conservative, and I think that we were overlapping, you know, during the administration period as well. So if you added that on, you know, to the cessation period, then, you know, I think if you said a 2 or 3 month period total, then I think that'd be conservative where you still have an ergogenic.
Yeah, and I think that Commissioner McBeth, sorry for my wave of timelines and stuff, but if all we saw, the real question to me was, if all we saw was the M3 metabolite in the testing for a 6 month period, no midterm, no short term, and no original oral turinabol, can we say with a high degree of certainty that there is no performance enhancing benefit? Because the evidence of re-ingestion of oral turinabol and the short-term and mid-term metabolites is not there. So all we're seeing is M3, which would imply that this compound was taken quite a while ago, farther back than the timeline I laid out of a 6-week cycle and 60 days of benefit. So what I'm trying to get to is that I have the same concern you do on the 10-month lapse. You know, and if you think about the 10-month lapse based on the evidence, it's absolutely possible, which he said he could have ingested at that time. We have no idea. So, but what we do know is from the point of around August of 18 until today, the longest he has not been tested is 32 days. Sometimes it's daily, sometimes it's weekly, and sometimes it's been bi-weekly. So based on what we know and what we're hearing, I kind of look at that time frame as a period as it pertains to residual performance enhancement as kind of the time frame that we can look at with some certainty. No, by no means absolute, but some more certainty than looking at this all the way back to the 17 days. I'll turn it over to you to keep going.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'd like to have Dr. Eichner talk a little bit more about this intermediate term metabolite, because I think we've established that parent drug, several days out of the system, short-term metabolites 1 to 2 weeks. We're vague about this midterm metabolite. We know the M3 can go way out. So are all 3 of the North American WADA certified labs testing for this intermediate metabolite, and what do we think the maximum time of detection of that is? Okay. Just wanting to be clear on the record what we're dealing with here as we kind of contemplate how to go forward.
Yeah, so thank you for that. The reason why I was vague on the intermediate metabolite detection is that we don't know. And so, you know, is it a few months? Is it 6 months? Not sure. That's deliberately vague because we don't know on that one now. You know, the reference material that's available for all the WADA accredited laboratories, there's not reference material for every single analyte for oral turinabol, and so all we could rely upon is using an excretion study. So we could use it to identify, but then we couldn't give you a close approximate concentration. You need reference material, certified reference material, to be able to give you an approximate concentration, because you've got to be able to compare it with the known value of something else. And we have that for the M3. We don't have it for all the other metabolites. So all we would be doing is identifying it and confirming it, and then we wouldn't really be able to give you a good estimate on what that concentration was. So there's a lot more that needs to be known about that. But again, coming back to what the lab's job usually is to identify the best way to detect a substance. And so you don't necessarily have every known analyte or metabolite in the screen for these things. My understanding is that the 3 North American labs are world leaders in this area and are probably looking for more analytes than a lot of other labs around the world for this kind of work.
But for the purposes of trying to have the highest confidence level that re-administration or re-ingestion was not actually taking place, and with the uncertainty around the intermediate metabolites, and we know that the M3 is going to be a long metabolite, is the certainty greatest around the short-term metabolites, and our confidence that that is a 1 to 2 week window that we're pretty confident that it would represent recent use.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, expanding on that, if the grains of salt in the Olympic swimming pool went up to even 100, 200, 500 picograms, but stayed as only indicating M3 only, your expert opinion is that it would not be re-ingestion, even though the picogram levels are higher.
I think that, you know, you're going to get to a concentration where I'm going to say this doesn't look like residual. I would like to see evidence of other metabolites in there as well. That would give you the most confidence to say this is absolutely, you know, re-administration. But I think you will get to a concentration either of the M3 metabolite where I would say this looks a little unusual, and it may be, you know, re-administration as to residual.
Okay, thank you.
But I think that's a very important point, because what you're essentially saying is each test, each M3 metabolite level needs to be evaluated independently, and we can't make a blanket statement that any M3 metabolite after the first offense that shows up in a potential fighter is residual.
I concur 100%.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman Barnell mentioned the frequency with which Mr. Jones has been tested. Would you have any comment, observations applying on that, on the testing cycle, the method being used? Do you think it's the best in the world that he's currently undergoing?
I think from the lab perspective, you know, more is more. You know, more data, the better for me to be able to make an interpretation like this. I think the frequency is on the high end of individuals. I think this athlete has been tested a lot compared to other athletes in other sports. I would also like to make it clear that the reference material that we're using to give you an approximate concentration of the M3 metabolite is newly made, and so I believe there may even be information on the table here that predated the reference material, and so we may only be giving you a really approximate concentration. I'm not too sure on the actual dates there, but I think that over-interpreting slight fluctuations in very low concentrations is dangerous.
Thank you.
Doctor, if I could be so bold as to ask you this, if you and really appreciate your expertise on this. You're opening a lot of eyes and answering a lot of questions for us. If John were to test today and the results were the same between 33 and 80 picograms, okay, would you, would that be a residual effect from the previous? I mean, would you assume, I know it's an assumption, I hear you, and I'm not trying to pin it, but I'm just saying, because of the picograms being from 33 to 80, which is what the line is here, would you assume?
I would probably be stronger, because if he was tested, the athlete was tested a week ago, and then a week later, he only has the M3 metabolite, as opposed to being negative a week ago, I would be stronger in saying there's zero evidence that he's reused in that short period, because we know with more confidence the detection window of the parent and the short-term metabolites. So I would be stronger on that one there, but if it comes down to it, my opinion clearly wouldn't change. There'd be no evidence of re-administration.
Thank you.
I have a question that you're not going to answer, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. Based on what you're saying, you know, and again, I think this points back to the evening of December 21st. What I'm hearing you say is that the idea of pulsing and residual has a high degree of probability that it's real. especially in something like this that we don't understand, and you've referenced some other drugs that we do understand and we see it. So it's not, I guess I wanted to talk about that briefly, that pulsing or residual effect from ingestion long periods of time ago is a real concept. In other words, it's not BS, it's the real deal.
Mr. Chairman, I've been in front of you before, and I hope you've always respected that I am truthful and honest in everything I've always said to you, and I think that we agree that I do that. There was a lot unknown about this substance. We don't know where it's sequestered. We do know that it's detected for a lot longer period than an oral steroid like this structure you would think would be detected for. So if you want to say, are the concentrations at the low level getting towards the limit of detection, the fluctuations we see at those low concentrations, are they real? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so that leads to my second question. It's actually a statement and a question. As we have tried to introduce consistency into our regulations as it pertains to anti-doping for the time that I've been here, not only what's on the list, you're accountable for what you put in your body, strict liability, zero tolerance standard. First offense to fourth offense, what a fighter can expect, no arbitrary and capricious decisions. Settlement agreements can allow for a reduction in those recommended sentences to bring consistency to what all fighters can expect of any type of unarmed combat. But at the same time, and we've held that line as firm as it can be held since the introduction of the, I believe it was November 16 regulation. And I also remember and recall when I got here, we were at the end of the era of the TUE, mass abuse on the TUE. And so, how do we deal with this? Because I've always also prided, as well as I know every other commissioner that's been here and chairman before me, of being the gold standard and doing what we can do to be as fair and consistent as we possibly can, but also understanding that the war on drugs and the science on drugs for performance enhancement as it pertains to our athletic realm is changing. It just changed in the hour or two we've had this hearing, and it will continue to change. Do you have any advice, recommendations, or thoughts on how a commission like the Nevada Athletic Commission should look at the idea of pulsing or residual, regardless of the drug, as new science introduces itself? I mean, the safe play is just to stick with the regulation and say, have a nice day. The more aggressive play is to look at the idea of residual as it pertains to certain drugs and certain athletes, and find a way to figure out how to learn more about them and adopt to them. But that can create a web of, it opens Pandora's box, or could, depending on how it's done. You're the foremost expert in the world. We trust you more than anybody in this room today, and always probably will. Do you have any thoughts or advice for the commission as we've asked you our questions on how we should look at ideas like this going forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the very kind words. I really appreciate that. Obviously, my work is, I work with pee and test tubes. I don't work with policy and
Don't make it sound so wonderful.
It's fantastic. Come and visit any time. But in all honesty, policy regulation, I don't do that. But I do understand data. And so I think that, as you said, as our knowledge evolves, and I love that word, because we've learned a lot about oral turinabol in the last few years. And if we just stuck at, well, no, this is the way it can only be detected for 50 days, and we just thought like that no matter what, then we wouldn't be doing a good job, because we've got new data that's opened us up now. Our knowledge has evolved as far as how these things, can persist for longer periods of time. And I think if you look at other substances that are also prohibited, some of the drugs that can be in cattle, for example, prohibited substances in sport, can you be exposed to that through meat contamination? Yeah, you can. And so my argument to you would be, I would deal these as a case-by-case basis. what's the evidence? And I think that if you identify, the M3 metabolite for the first time, I don't think there's any disagreement that there's been exposure at some time. So that's someone has to answer that. But as far as if you only see the M3 metabolite going forward, I would highly encourage you to do it a case-by-case basis where you be able to get the data, have a longitudinal evaluation of what you're seeing, and then make an individual-based determination, because I don't think it's easy enough to say if you have a concentration above or below this, then this is what happens. I think that's difficult. I think it has to, every case has to be taken individually, and I hope for everyone's sake, including mine, that we don't get a lot of these going forward. But that's what I would propose, even though it's a lengthy process, to look at every individual case and look at the merits of that case. Just like you would on a case that's potentially consistent with meat contamination.
What you said was very interesting. If it's case by case, and it's a first-time M3 metabolite case, then there's an ingestion, obviously ingestion, and obvious accountability that needs to be taken with that ingestion. It's really what happens on this specific drug and this specific metabolite potentially post that original case, and how it's monitored and how the athlete is monitored, and trying to understand that.
Sure.
And I know you don't make policy, and I knew that's why you wouldn't answer my question, but I was curious, and you did kind of give some interesting things to think about, so I appreciate that. Any other questions? Mr. Green, do you have any questions for Dr. Eichner?
I think he's been up here long enough. I certainly don't want to add anything more to his day, so no.
Okay. Dr. Eichner, I appreciate it. Do you have any time constraints? Airplanes or?
My flight's not till 5:30, so I'm around if you need me.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you. Hopefully we won't be here till anytime after 4:45. No, I'm just kidding. God, you guys are a tough group. Okay. Mr. Green, who would you like to bring forward next?
I propose that we call Dr. Fedoruk next, but I would just maybe suggest with respect to 5-minute breaks so we can get him on the phone, make sure that the connection is good, so we don't have to sit here and watch, just try to call him.
Do you believe that Dr. Fedoruk would answer the questions any differently than Dr. Eichner did?
Probably not. I mean, I can't really answer that for him, but I know that they were in unison on December 20th in terms of their opinion. Dr. Fedoruk is an employee of USADA, so he comes at this a little bit differently, and maybe he'll answer those policy questions in a different way, since he's...
I think that the policy questions maybe be more appropriate from Mr. Cook that's here today. I don't know. And I don't know. I don't want to not allow you to bring forward whoever you'd like. So if you'd like
I don't want to bring in duplicative evidence. I mean, look, we're here today to try to offer up everything the commission feels like it needs. If you don't feel like you need Dr. Fedoruk to testify, we're happy to yield, but I would say I don't think there's any harm in bringing him forward and asking him the same questions. If they are duplicative, then they are, but I think that also helps to show we have another opinion of the four here so you can hear it.
Okay. We're certainly going to take a break. Why don't you call him? I think it would be great if you called him and got him on the phone.
Sure.
And you can maybe take the 5, or if you need 10 minutes, and describe what's transpired here. Because I really don't want to ask him the same questions. That
I suggested that he watch on the streaming. I think that it's being streamed, right? I suggested that to Attorney Cook to ask him. So I hope he's watching on the streaming. I don't know.
Why don't you confirm that and see if he concurs, and maybe we do get him on the phone and look for his concurrence in these discussions. If not, and he has anything he'd like to add, I'd certainly like to hear from him. Has he been on the phone? He has been on the phone the whole time too. Perfect. So why don't you take we'll take the 5-minute break. You can talk to him off on this side. We'll certainly allow him to come in over the phone, see if he has anything he'd like to add, and if not, we'll move to discussions with I believe Mr. Cook from USADA.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll
get hungry.
We'll pick this back up. Mr. Green, thoughts?
Well, I spoke to Dr. Fedoruk, and I think it would be helpful to hear from him. He thought that he could potentially comment on some of the policy issues that you had talked about with Dr. Eichner as well.
Okay, so he'd like the opportunity to chime in on some policy.
He would.
Does he have anything to that he'd like to talk about as it pertains to science?
Why don't we just give him that opportunity?
Okay, great. So why don't we go ahead and let Dr. Fedoruk through on the line?
The conference is no longer in listen-only mode.
Dr. Fedoruk, are you on the phone?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. If you could help us, please state and spell your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Matthew Fedoruk. And the last name is spelled S-E-D-O-R-U-K.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to probably take this just a little bit slower to help with the understanding over the intercom system and for the court reporter to be able to gather exactly what you're saying. So I'm going to turn it over to you. It's good that you were able to listen in on the questions and answers with Dr. Eichner. And I would allow you to maybe add some comments or testimony on any place that you think was not covered, and or if you would like to answer or provide additional testimony to any of the questions that you heard, please feel free to do so. And then when you are done, we may have some additional questions for you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Always on cell phone.
Should I proceed, or Mr. Green, do you have any questions first?
I don't think we have any questions first, though, but your phone is cutting in and out pretty badly. Are you on a cell phone or are you on a landline?
I'm on a cell phone.
Okay, why don't we try, we'll let you comment on whatever you'd like to comment on or add to. If it becomes where we can't understand you, then we're just going to have to, well, I'll go back to you and ask you what you want to do. Because usually that's the case when they're on the phone. So why don't you go ahead and we'll see if we can get through this.
Okay. I had a chance to listen to Dr. Eichner's testimony, and I concur with his opinion, and I think the commissioners did an excellent job of asking the relevant questions. And I concur with Dr. Eichner's answers. I would just like to add that the detection of long-term metabolites isn't limited to just the DMT compound in question, but the discovery of long-term metabolites for other anabolic agents has been one of the most important advancements in increasing the detection window of prohibited steroids and anti-doping. With regards to Mr. Jones's passport, and it was mentioned at the beginning of the hearing, the importance of longitudinal samples and looking for signs of doping over time as we collect more samples from an athlete. I would want to testify that both Mr. Jones' steroid passport and his blood passport do not show any signs of doping with anabolic agents. Finally, with regard to the policy question that was asked, I completely agree that every case needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, because every athlete is exposed to different prohibited substances in different ways, and their particular set of circumstances means that the science for each single case has to be analyzed independently rather than making the same type of decisions and coming to a conclusion without all the evidence that pertains to that particular athlete's particular case. I think if you were looking for some direction regarding how to handle an athlete that tests positive and continues to test positive, one of the important things that you can do is continue to conduct testing to demonstrate that the compound is still being seen in residual levels rather than the parent or the short or medium-term metabolites that were discussed. And there's been other cases that we've seen where athletes may continue to test positive for anabolic agents for extended periods of time. And it's no fault of the laboratory. Their job is to detect the substances to their best ability. And therefore, we need to look at the science in order to make the best possible decisions and the most fair decisions for athletes.
Okay. Thank you for that. Are there any questions from any of the commissioners?
A question regarding take this up by a case-by-case basis, consider individual circumstances, and let's pay attention to the data. And my question to you is in the situation where you haven't identified the source of the ingestion, how do we ensure that the testing regimen is consistent such that we can make a determination? I think there's a 10-month gap in Mr. Jones's testing protocol that seems like we wouldn't have left that large of a gap, and I'm just not sure how that occurred.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think from a policy perspective, one could perhaps consider a requirement in order to conduct testing at regular intervals in order to monitor an athlete while they're serving a sanction. That is not currently, to my knowledge, a mandatory requirement within various anti-doping programs. So that may be a way to pay more attention during the period after the initial positive and during the sanctioning period to allow for more accurate determination and ensure there's no gaps in an athlete's history in order to be more sure that an athlete is not reusing a particular substance.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here on the phone, and we're going to now, unless you have anything else you'd like to offer, Mr. Green has any questions of you, you're more than welcome to stay on the phone, but we'll go ahead and mute the phone again. Is that acceptable?
Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you. Okay, great. I think it would be...
The conference is now in listen-only mode.
Mr. Green, I think it would be appropriate to bring forward Mr. Cook from USADA at this point.
Sure.
Unless you disagree.
I think that's completely appropriate.
Okay, let's do that. Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Mr. Cook. You've already been sworn in, so I think at this part, unless I'm misunderstanding, why don't you already give us your name, why don't you give us your role at USADA?
Certainly. I'm the Results Management and Investigation Senior Director at USADA.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think that would probably be appropriate with your position at USADA for the Commission to maybe go about some of its questions as it pertains to policy, as it pertains to how USADA came to make some of its determinations and those types of things, but not necessarily based on the science, because I'm assuming you're not a PhD in microbiology.
Only a JD.
Oh, well, that's a lot farther than the rest of us got. including Mr. Green, who admitted that out of the gate. So, great. So I'll turn it over to the fellow commissioners, and we'll go about our questioning for Mr. Cook. You want to? I'm a linear thinker, so we go left to right. You want to start thinking?
Sure. All right. I'll do that. I'll kind of stick with the last question, Mr. Cook, on the 10-month gap. Have you considered changing the way USADA would test athletes who tested positive to Ranabol, knowing that this M3 long-term metabolite could be a confusing issue for future commissions?
Yes, as Dr. Fedoruk mentioned, that's an excellent question, and especially in retrospect, now knowing what we know about oral Turinabol, which we did not know during that 10-month period, it would have been helpful to have more data points during that period. I'd also note that it was during that period that his case was pending, and USADA was having regular interactions with him. And so at the time, I just want to provide that context for what was going on during that time period. It wasn't as if Mr. Jones was off with no contact with USADA during that time.
But just to be clear, no contact and no tests are two different things.
Correct.
Great, thank you, Mr. Cook. I have, my questions start out a little bit in line with the notification process of the test results. Was the USADA letter that was signed by you, that was sent on December 6th to notify Mr. Jones of his test results over the course of August, September, October, the first time or the first form of communication of the adverse findings that was provided to Mr. Jones?
Of the August and September results, yes.
Was it the first form of communication on that date to UFC?
In writing, yes.
Okay. Because again, based on the UFC anti-doping policy, and I'll refer to 7.13, as it's in front of me, if the initial review of an adverse and analytical finding cause the adverse analytical finding, USADA shall promptly and simultaneously give notice to the athlete, UFC, and Athletic Commission, if applicable. So, I think part of the line of question is because all of this fell, quite honestly, on our laps on December 21st. And were triggered by the initial notification on December 6th, which certainly didn't include the California Athletic Commission prior to their hearing on the 11th. So I don't know if you're prepared to answer my question, but my question is, if there was an adverse finding result in August and an adverse finding, why wasn't there notification? If the anti-doping policy gives guidance that the notice should simultaneously give it to the athlete, UFC, I understand at that time there wasn't an athletic commission involved, so I'm removing athletic commission, but UFC and the athlete himself, I'm looking to better understand why there wasn't proper notification at the time of the results.
Are you referring to the timing of the notification?
Yes, I'm referring to the December 6th letter to Mr. Jones notifying him that he had adverse finding test results in August and September did not occur until December 6th.
I understand. This brings me actually back to the chairman's opening remarks, in which he mentioned that he is here and wants to do the right thing. And I want to reiterate to the commissioners that that is what I come to USADA every day to do as well. I was a federal prosecutor before joining USADA, and I took pride in coming to work every day in that role and in my role at USADA to do the right thing. And so when we got the results from Mr. Jones's test in August and September, like we do every day, we try to figure out what to do and what the right thing to do is. And during that time is when we were growing in our understanding of what, how this metabolite behaves, as been recounted by Dr. Eichner and Dr. Fedora concurred. This knowledge, this research, this was all happening in that span between August, September, and December. We were gathering information from other anti-doping organizations. We were reviewing it, having our scientists review it, and we were trying to determine what the right thing to do would be in this situation. Given what we knew about Mr. Jones, given what we knew about his test history, and given what we knew, or what we understood the behavior of this metabolite was in other sports and other athletes, and how it was staying in the system for such a long period of time. And so, as soon as we were able to be confident in our understanding of how to interpret those results, is the moment that we provided those notifications on those results and how we were handling them.
And was UFC involved in that process or study and discussion of this new pattern of M3 results that looked, out ordinary?
Not to my knowledge. USADA is independent from the UFC, and all of my discussions about how to handle this did not involve the UFC.
Okay, but they were first notified in writing on December 6th, I believe, is what you responded.
Yes.
That would imply that there was conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be precise, and I'm trying to remember back to early December, and I think there may have been a phone call prior to the letter that I maybe alluded to the fact that this letter was coming, and I don't have a very clear memory of what exactly was said, but I vaguely remember there being a phone call shortly before the letter went out.
You feel that you had, and maybe I'll even give you, I'll throw you a layup and say in hindsight, that there was potential obligation to notify the California Athletic Commission based on the timing of their hearing?
USADA was not notified of the date of their hearing. So before that letter went out, and my understanding was that they didn't have jurisdiction over those test results. However, the Nevada State Athletic Commission did not either. However, because of the upcoming fight in Nevada at the end of December, out of courtesy and abundance of caution, USADA went ahead and notified the Nevada Commission of these results so that there would be a preview of this is still in the system. This may impact how the fight proceeds at the end of December, so we wanted to make sure that the Nevada Commission had as much notice as we could provide about this issue as soon as we came to our own understanding of what was happening.
And we do appreciate being included in that document and communication. I know that Dr. Eichner provided us some guidance that they've been studying over the last 4 or 5 years, this potential for this long-term metabolite to continue to show up. And I think outside of grain of salt in the Olympic swimming pool, the new word is pulsing around this situation. Can you provide any information on behalf of USADA as why this has never come up before until now, at least on behalf of our commission?
I don't want to step into Dr. Eichner or Dr. Fedorik's territory, but my understanding of it from the outside with relating to the scientific aspects of it are that testing is becoming more advanced and more sensitive, and in addition to the M3 metabolite, there was a recent study published related to clomiphene showing that this can occur as well. So I don't know that it is limited to one substance. And based on the sensitivity and the frequency with which athletes are being tested, I think more data is being collected from which to understand, sometimes for the first time, how these metabolites are behaving at very, very low levels within the body.
Thank you. I may have more, but I want to give my fellow commissioners a chance as well.
Executive Director Bennett, I understand you'd like to ask a couple of questions, so I'll let you go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, Mr. Cook, Commissioner Orlando just asked you if you had any communication with the UFC prior to the letter coming out on December 6th. You hesitated and you said not in writing. Then you subsequently stated, because you want to do the right thing, of course, you subsequently stated, well, I might have had a phone call with them shortly before that. Is that your testimony right now, that you don't recall having, that USADA doesn't recall having a conversation with any of the executives of the UFC based on the adverse analytical findings on August 28th and September 18th of 2018?
My recollection is that not until shortly before the December 6th letter went out is when I first had a communication with Mr. Nowitzki at the UFC, who's my primary point of contact there, about because they have, the UFC has access to the results of testing, and these results were listed as pending. And so there was a question about why they were still pending after so long. And my response was something to the effect of, wait a day or two, there's a letter that's going to address that is about to come out. That is what I remember of that conversation shortly before the December 6th letter went out.
Okay, and you felt, or you thought, that the California State Athletic Commission did not have jurisdiction over Mr. Jones at that time with those two adverse analytical findings that I previously mentioned. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. Then the California Athletic Commission had a hearing on December 11th. I would like to know what gives USADA the authorization to adjudicate those two tests that I previously mentioned and couple them into the July 28, 2017 finding, which resulted in a 18-month suspension, and because Mr. Jones provided substantial cooperation, was reduced 3 months to 15 months. What authorization do you have to do that?
Well, just to clarify, it was a 15-month sanction imposed by Arbitrator McLaren during a hearing, and the authority is under the UFC anti-doping policy, which the athletes agree to follow as part of the UFC program.
Okay. Were you aware of the fact that Mr. Jones still owed the California State Athletic Commission $205,000 as he was fined? And if that fine was still outstanding, why would you not think they have jurisdiction?
I'm not involved in the California State Athletic Commission's either finding or collection of finding of Mr. Jones, and so I'm not aware and was not aware of that fact.
And who is?
Who is aware of that?
Who would be aware of that from USADA? Seeing how you do the testing for the UFC.
Well,
we have an adverse analytical finding.
They're independent programs, so the California State Athletic Commission is in charge of their sanctioning, and USADA is in charge of its sanctioning. We communicate and try to run effective programs.
Would it surprise you to know that Mr. Foster approves, according to him last evening, 99.9% of the licenses in California State, according to Mr. Foster and my conversation last night. The one that he didn't authorize was for Mr. Jones, and Mr. Jones came before California State Athletic Commission. When I had informed Mr. Foster subsequent to that commission about your letter, he was, I would say, quite upset based on the fact that he took the responsibility to speak on behalf of Mr. Jones and authorize, speak on his behalf and recommend a license for Mr. Jones to fight in the state of California, not knowing he had 2 adverse analytical findings before that. And had he known that, according to Mr. Foster, and unfortunately he's not here today, but I would be happy to say this under oath, he would not, they would, according to Mr. Foster, he would not have given Mr. Jones a license. So I think, as I stated to you on the phone, and General Counsel William, I'm sorry, I forget his last name, you have a really significant flaw in your reporting system to the various commissions that look out for the health and safety of the fighters.
I would just note in response to that Mr. Foster was apprised of the adverse analytical findings and did license Mr. Jones to fight at the end of December of the commission did, with full knowledge of those tests.
Say that again, please.
The commission did license Mr. Jones to fight at the end of December with full knowledge of Mr. Jones's testing history.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that the jurisdictional argument will be one that none of the, well, let's just say none of us will all agree. So Nevada regulations are pretty broad as it pertains to jurisdiction, even though we choose to enforce them minimally. I think going forward, it would be advisable that we're kept informed as we go down the line here. Because, and I understand that this statement may be challenged, but I would argue if you read our regs and participated in those workshops, that those regs are much broader than when a fight's announced, as far as it pertains to jurisdiction. I would not hold you accountable today, though, for anything other than you did with the state of Nevada. I think that was appropriate. But if Mr. Jones is under suspension in the state of California, for you to say that you're not sure if that's in his jurisdiction, I think is an error on your part, and your organization should reconsider that. If he's under a 15th or 18-month suspension in California, he's in their jurisdiction, period. And if California doesn't take that approach, then I can only say I wouldn't agree with that either. But when they laid that down, or are you saying that you laid that down and they did not? And that's
that was
USADA
suspension.
And they rode with it.
I think that was determined in the December hearing.
Did it happen while he was in their jurisdiction, the test? Or did they decide to just not ride with you? So maybe what I said as a statement would maybe be more redirected as a question. With the original suspension for the M3 metabolite, whose jurisdiction was he in at that time? Nobody's?
From July 2017?
Yeah.
That was a joint with California.
Okay. So I think it's not something we need to drag out because I don't think it's pertinent at this point to the issue at hand. What?
If I may, Chairman, we have Mr. Foster that's been listening to this. I'd be happy to show this on the record. He just texted me to say, Bob, we didn't know about those 2 tests on December 11th. So obviously there's misinformation between the California State Athletic Commission and what you're testifying to under oath today.
Let me clarify, Mr. Bennett.
Oh, please do.
What I was referring to was the license, a lot developed between December 11th and December 29th, when there was a fight that was held in California. And so when that fight moved to California, there was information that was transferred to the California State Athletic Commission. That's what I was referring to. I wasn't referring to the timing of the December 11th hearing, so I apologize if that was...
So to be clear, you're referring to the hearing that happened in December 20-something that allowed him to fight on December 29th, where he was given his license?
So the December 11th hearing, at that hearing, Mr. Bennett is correct. I'm not suggesting that California Commission had Mr. Jones's test results. What I was referring to was before the December 29th hearing. So between December 11th and the December 29th fight is when more information was transferred to the California Commission.
Okay.
I apologize if that was not clear.
I just think maybe to sum this up so we can keep this moving in the direction as it pertains to Mr. Jones. There are clear issues between USADA and athletic commissions and promoters. Issues is not the wrong word, but we're not all on the same page. And in my opinion, what suffers from this is a credibility by all. My credibility suffers, your credibility suffers. And notice, in my opinion, is different than disclosure. But fighters that are in these jurisdictions that have, like Dr. Eichner said, adverse findings, clear and defined. Not that there might not be mitigating circumstances, and not that there might not be science that we still have to understand. We've got to get to a faster and more direct disclosure process. But we all need to understand that that doesn't mean we need to rush to judgment as science is evolving. But it's hard to digest months and months of tests that you've decided that you're going to hold on to till you kind of determine what you think it is. When the man is under suspension from a California, not Jon Jones per se, any man or any woman that's a fighter is under that jurisdiction that they were suspended, and we have to get to a higher standard of credibility amongst all of our organizations. Because to just tell you right now, the public ain't buying this. I'm not buying it. I think it's weak and it's soft. So, and I think that we all can do better. So let's, that's my statement to that. It has nothing to do with Mr. Jones. So it's a side issue. I'm glad that you got that out. We need to probably move on from that.
Yeah,
so,
and I would just add, Chairman, that as it does relate to why we're here today, is we're here to, had we had information available to us in a timely manner, we wouldn't have, UFC would not potentially have been moving the fight on Christmas week. So that is my line of questioning as it relates to why we're here today.
All right. Are there any other questions?
I would just add that the test results were known to USADA when we licensed Jon to fight here, and we did not know about that.
That is correct. So let's move on. Obviously, you went about this the way you went about it. We can all debate if it was right or wrong, but you did what you did, and you seem to be pretty firm that you stand behind it to try to do the right thing. I'll ask you the same question I asked Dr. Eichner, and you obviously do have an influence on policy, overseeing the UFC's, program. How do we look at this going forward? Remove Jon Jones as the discussion here today. How do we move forward with other fighters that will show, because from our understanding, we've had dialogue with NHL, MLB, NBA. This M3 metabolite issue is not just in front of the Nevada Athletic Commission, it's everywhere. But we're getting better at it, we're understanding it. How do we go about this as an athletic commission? How are you going to go about it as USADA going forward? Because this won't be the last time we have this discussion, right?
It's not. USADA has other cases involving this substance, and so it's, as Dr. Eichner and Dr. Fedor mentioned, each one is handled on a case-by-case basis. I think there are certain principles that we try to keep in mind in handling these cases fairly, reasonably, and appropriately. And one of those is the principle of double jeopardy. And the other principle of due process. And so in USADA's, in the policy, the adjudication process, those principles are embodied, and they're set forth in the regulations and the rules that USADA abides by under the UFC anti-doping policy. And what they say is that in order to proceed with a second violation, USADA has the burden of proving that the violation occurred after the athlete received notification of the first violation. It's a standard double jeopardy provision, meaning if the violation occurred prior to it ever being noticed, then it's all going to be counted as a single violation. And a second violation can only be considered a second violation if it occurred after he received notice of that first violation. Secondly, due process. USADA's rules encompass an adjudication process where it's decided by a neutral arbitrator or arbitrators if the athlete wants to take the case to a hearing, where a full evidentiary hearing can be had, witnesses, experts, testimony, direct cross-examination, arguments, written submissions. So all of that is encompassed in the rules that USADA abides by in handling these cases. Of course, just like in our legal system, under these rules, a case can be resolved via settlement agreement prior to going to a hearing, because there's no reason to be inefficient and having all of these written submissions and evidence if everybody's on the same page. And certainly, USADA wants and strives to have open lines of communications with the commissions, and so that we are being as transparent as possible with the commissions so that the commission understands how USADA arrived at its conclusions and reciprocate, and USADA will reciprocate by understanding and being a part of this hearing and other hearings where USADA can be of any assistance to the commission in you reaching a reasonable and fair decision in any matter. So those are a couple of the principles that I wanted to highlight in terms of how I believe this commission and other commissions can approach these difficult cases. At the front end, it requires investigation and cooperation from the athlete. And so those are also principles that USADA abides by, and we have investigators, and we spend a lot of energy and time investigating these cases. And that goes to Commissioner Alonso's questions before in terms of that delay. That was very diligent investigation going on during that time to try to reach a fair and just outcome in the case. And that's what we do for every case. And so bringing that all together, in my mind, is an effective results management program, and one that can be both case specific, but also be fair across the board.
So let me, you gave me a lot of what I know. Tell me what I don't know. How do you plan on moving forward with this specific M3 metabolite as it pertains to all cases? And I don't want you to give me anything here on the record that would disclose anything that's highly confidential inside USADA. But we have dozens of athletes in certain sports that are bouncing around with this. Some sports are taking completely different paths and saying you follow the rule, you know, boom, you're gone. You have obviously made a choice to say that's not how we're going to do this, because you said basically the guy's cleared to fight. So you have opposite ends of the spectrum here as an anti-doping agency, and then there are commissions in sports for all kinds of athletes in all kinds of places. I'm assuming it's going to be a case-by-case example, but let's get specific as it pertains to oral turinabol and that metabolite. How do you see policy being set at a high level, or whatever you can say, as it pertains to this particular drug? And I ask the question because my concern is around the Pandora's box and the TUE days. I was here for the end of the TUE days, and those were a complete joke. And they never should have been done, and the commissions figured out very quickly that they had been duped. So allowing somebody to fight with any level of the M3 metabolite, once that happens, how are you going to control that? Because you know what happens after that. It's already happened. It's already started. It started on whenever you released this to the world, that this was the idea of residual pulsing for the M3 metabolite. Athletes took that and ran with it 30 days ago. How do we deal with it?
So in looking how to apply some generalities or general principles
That's
to
fair. That's
each.
fair. I don't want you to go into the weeds because I don't want you to give up your internal stuff, but we need to talk about this as a commission. We need to understand that policy.
Right. No, I understand, and I appreciate the question and the opportunity. The one difference, and this goes back to the double jeopardy point, one difference is between an initial positive and a second or third positive, right? So in Mr. Jones's case, as we know, his initial positive resulted in a lengthy sanction and a lengthy results management process to get there, but at the end of the day, it's a 15-month sanction. In subsequent samples that are collected, okay, now you're in a different framework. So that's one difference. We have cases now that it's a first positive, so we're going to handle those differently.
I think that right there is the same thing I heard Dr. Eichner say.
Right.
And to me, that's something that I'm open to subscribing to as I've heard the testimony. That is a clear, that gives me a clear differentiating point. So I'll let you continue.
So that's the first point. The second point is to look at the levels and what's being found. Is it just the M3 metabolite, or is it parent, medium-term metabolites, and the long-term metabolite? And if it's just the long-term metabolite, what's the level? Is it over a nanogram, or is it 100 picograms or less? I mean, as Dr. Eichner mentioned, you can't overinterpret, a change between 30 and 60 picograms, but the difference between 30 picograms and 1 or 1.5 nanograms, I would think Dr. Eichner would agree that that's significant. So the level is something to consider. It's a factor. Another factor would be your interactions with the athlete through the investigation process that I mentioned before, which is really done at the outset of these cases. When we're talking with the athlete, is the athlete being cooperative? How cooperative? How open? What's the documentation surrounding supplement usage? What are the test results of supplement usage? All of those things are factors, and so there's not. That's why it's a case-by-case basis. But these are some of the steps and some of the factors that are considered in looking at these cases on an individual basis.
Okay. Are there any other questions from any of the commissioners?
Maybe you could just expand on your second one, that after the first positive M3 adverse analytical finding, you said you're going to handle those different going forward. Could you expand on that?
You're talking about a second or third sample that test positive? Those would be handled differently? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I guess I'm still wanting some clarification going back to the 10-month gap in testing. So how are you approaching anybody after they've been defined as having their initial positive M3? How are you going to manage them going forward?
I see. So yes, there is a deliberate follow-up testing being done to monitor those levels, and then analysis coupled with the other factors I mentioned of the subsequent samples to confirm or try to confirm that those are in fact residual, which then adds to the overall data set that we have to draw upon to see the excretion of this substance.
Yeah, I don't want to put words in the chairman's mouth, but I think the details of that is what would be interesting to us.
I think, Commissioner Macbeth, the way I understood what Mr. Cook said was that hypothetically we have another athlete that comes in here and it's the first time they've tested for the M3 metabolite. Correct. The way I understood the answer is that is a first-time offense. and some rigorous follow-up testing process. But you're not just going to let anybody off the hook for the first M3 metabolite test. Because if you have the first M3 metabolite test, you have obviously ingested the original compound, and it's the first time it's been discovered. After that, post-discovery of another athlete X, first ingestion, first discovery of the M3 metabolite, it's going to probably ride with the original adjudication that Mr. Jones received, which was 18 months reduced down to 15. Heavy. But that was also because he was a second offender from his prior testing. So in our world, the way I'm interpreting this is that if we have another, what Mr. Cook is saying is we have another athlete come in here, first time we see the M3 metabolite. All right, if we were to look at this as allowing somebody under the M3 metabolite to fight, first offense, you're following NAC code. There's no debate. But because of this specific drug, a more enhanced testing program is administered and required in order to get back into the octagon or ring post the original or first time test. That's the way I understood what you were saying. And I'm interpreting that more in the athletic commission way, but first offenders are first offenders.
That's correct, and a word on first offenders for this substance, because now that we have a better understanding of at least the length of time that this could potentially stay in one's system, that's something to consider in evaluating the athlete's ability to find the source, potentially. So that's another, so even though you are correct, first offender is first offender, there will be a violation and a sanction. It's just something to factor into maybe the length of sanction or in evaluating the case with respect to whether or not that athlete is able to identify the source of that positive.
And I would just completely agree with you, Mr. Chairman. That's exactly how I was looking at it. I guess as we talked about the policy, because what you're describing going forward is not what was applied to Mr. Jones. And so it's a change, and I'm just wondering, are we going to be able to see the details of that, what the policy of managing a first offender is going forward? How much more frequently would you test them?
In terms of testing numbers, I can't give you a specific number other than to say that it's that there's deliberate follow-up and regular testing. We don't have specific quotas defined for that purpose, other than to deliberately do follow-up testing to better understand excretion and to confirm that it's residual.
Mr. Cook, you mentioned double jeopardy, I think 3 times that I counted. Is that part of the policy of USADA, or is that do the right thing? Can you talk more about, because you've made that point, I think 3 or 4 times.
Yes, it's enshrined in UFC anti-doping policy, specifically Article 10.7.4 of the policy, which discusses multiple violations. And it says, for purposes of imposing sanctions under Article 10.7, which is the multiple violations article, an anti-doping policy violation will only be considered a second violation if USADA can establish that the athlete or other person committed the second anti-doping policy violation after the athlete or other person received notice pursuant to Article 7, and that's referring to notice of the first anti-doping policy violation.
Okay, thank you.
I may have one other question for you, and I also, Dr. Eckner, I know you're still here, I would pose this to you as well. In any of the cases, if you can speak to them, have we ever found a source? Do we know of, and I guess the question would be, obviously, the source would be, yeah, you know, I took some oral Turinabol. That's great. Do we know where they're getting it? Do we know where it's coming from? Do we know or if you found it in an actual supplement, a contaminated supplement. Do we have any knowledge of the source of this that you could speak to?
In intentional doping cases, we have identified the source. For cases involving very low level, low picogram level of the M3 metabolite, I would say it's very rare to find the source.
Okay. All right. I don't have any further questions on this.
Hey, Dr. Eichner, do you have anything that you would add? Thanks.
Let the record reflect that he shook his head this way.
I just have one more question, and Dr. Eichner discussed this a little. You brought up the levels as part of the future review, and you referenced at a nanogram level, right, that it may make you hesitate or possibly evaluate new ingestion. Is that what you would view as a minimum threshold level that could indicate new or re-ingestion?
Just to confirm, are you asking me or Dr. Eichner?
I'm asking you, sorry.
Okay. I would defer to Dr. Eichner and Dr. Fedoruk for the most part, if not entirely, on that question. But certainly, I mean, I can tell you this, in the intentional doping cases, we have seen it over a nanogram.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Do you have any questions for Mr. Cook? Okay. Thank you.
It would be fun to ask him questions.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
I guess at this point, Mr. Green, do you have any additional people you'd like to call forward?
Nothing further, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and I know that the UFC is here. Does the UFC, Mr. Nowitzki, Mr. Ratner, Mr. Campbell, do you have anything that you would like to add to the record of the testimony today? Does anybody on the commission have any questions of them? Okay. Mr. Jones, could you please come back forward, sir? There's way too many people yawning in the audience, so I figured that we've gotten to the point of boring. I caught you napping back there, so I'm glad you're relaxed. Do you have, I guess right now, would the commission have any final questions, or first, would you have a final statement you'd like to make to the commission before? Because the process at this point is I'm going to close the hearing, and once I close the hearing so commissioners are clear, there are no more questions for anybody in the audience or any of the witnesses. I can reopen, but would prefer not to.
I prefer
have a
to
question
make
at
a
this
closing
point.
on behalf of Mr. Jones.
I'm sorry?
I'd like to make a closing on behalf of Mr. Jones.
You'll get that opportunity. I'm just making sure before we get to your closing statement that there are no additional questions for the people who testified today or anybody else in the audience that you would like to have come forward. Everybody's speak now or forever hold your peace. And if we get to something real serious, I will open it back up. I don't want to do that. So, Mr. Green, I will turn it over to you for your closing statement, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I promise to be brief. I know that on December 23rd, the Commission agreed to allow Mr. Jones to appear today to allow for a measured, thoughtful, and comprehensive discussion of his anti-doping testing protocol results and provide an opportunity for the Commission to determine the appropriate path forward for him in Nevada. I think it was a very good discussion that hopefully revealed the science that we had said in our submission and we promised would be here today. I mean, I think a few things came out in terms of themes. One, there's absolutely no evidence of re-administration after July 28th, 2017. And two, while he wasn't tested for the 10-month gap between October 2017 and August of 2018, I think there's two important things to bear in mind there. The first one is Dr. Fedoruk importantly said his steroid profile and his blood passport were both normal and did not indicate any usage in that period. So I think that's an important biomarker to understand. That's the first thing. The second thing is he was subject to testing during that entire period, and as Mr. Cook said, was preparing for his hearing. It would have been fairly bold behavior to intentionally take, or even, at that point somehow ingest DHCMT while he was getting ready for a hearing, facing a lifetime ban potentially. And there's no evidence at all that it actually took place, although there is that gap It wasn't his fault that he wasn't tested, and certainly it's not fair to hold that against him. Certainly since August of 2018, he's been probably the most tested athlete on the planet. If you look at all of his test results, and he's been doing the VADA testing since December 28th, and he'll continue to do that testing. And as a way forward here, if the commission, as Mr. Jones said himself in his opening, would want him to continue that VADA testing beyond the agreed upon period with California, we would certainly agree to that. I think it's helpful to continue to have as much data as possible. And certainly Mr. Jones is completely an open book, wants to be tested as much as possible so that there are no issues with any more gaps like there were in that 10-month gap when he was subject to testing but not actually tested. So as a condition of reinstatement, he would be happy to continue to do the testing. I know Dr. Goodman is here today from VADA, and that's who has been doing the testing in addition to USADA under the California State Athletic Commission agreement for reinstatement. I'm not going to try to recreate Dr. Eichner's testimony, but I think it's pretty clear that without any presence of other metabolites beyond the M3 long-term metabolite at the low picogram levels that he has been in his urine in August, September, December, and we think the most recent results, as I'd said, perhaps continue to have the low levels in January. There's no evidence of re-administration, and as far as what makes sense going forward in terms of the appropriate path for him, I believe it would be appropriate to follow the lead here of USADA in the sense of looking at the first M3 metabolite positive for which he was punished very differently than any subsequent positive. And even though the rules I understand don't have a double jeopardy provision, I don't think it's going to weaken the program, for my 2 cents, if you put one in there, because I think it's only fair to not punish somebody again if there's no evidence that there's been any re-administration, which there is none here. So he's happy to, as I said, follow the protocol in California, which is every time there is a presence of M3 long-term metabolite without any presence of a short-term or intermediate metabolite at a low level, as part of VADA or USADA testing, the authority here is Dr. Eichner and Smurtle, and if it's their opinion that there's no re-administration, then it doesn't count as another anti-doping rule violation. And I think that that's a fair way of approaching this. Obviously, John's hopeful that we leave here today with a decision being made. We respect the Commission's authority to not make a decision today, but he's certainly hopeful that there will be one made today. This has been weighing on him for a long time, and he wants to put this behind him and just focus on fighting. And from my perspective, he certainly has that right. So I'm happy to answer any other questions. I don't need to go on. The testimony is what it is for over 2 hours, so I don't need to summarize it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jones, do you have anything you want to say?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. Any of the commissioners have any final questions for Mr. Green or Mr. Jones? Executive Director Bennett?
Mr. Jones, I understand that you gave substantial assistance to USADA, and that's why you got a downward departure from 18 months to 15 months.
That's actually not correct, Mr. Bennett.
Okay.
There was substantial assistance, but we're not prepared to discuss it today here in public. It's not appropriate, and it's confidential under the USADA rules. The reduction by Mr. McLaren was from 18 to 15 based upon his evaluation of Mr. Jones's degree of fault.
Okay.
But I'm not going to permit him to answer any.
But it's certainly not the federal rules, so that's fine. If he doesn't want to share with us in an effort to, have the opportunity to have the privilege of being licensed here, and it's confidential, then I understand it.
Yeah, I just ask that you respect the confidentiality of that.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Okay, I'll close the hearing. Good night. Okay, so we've heard a lot of evidence and a lot of testimony. I appreciate everybody's participation in this. Before we start deliberating this, I just want to reiterate for the record, this is exactly in Nevada how this is going to go. We will not be rushed to judgment. We will not be given information at the last minute and decide things that are this sensitive. This is exactly how it should go. The public should get to see exactly what we have to say, exactly what the experts have to say. So I'm very proud of today's hearing, regardless of the outcome and the decision that we all decide to make. But it's important to me that there's integrity in the public process and that the public understands exactly what this commission is thinking. So in saying that, I would turn it over to the commissioners to start the discussion. Happy to entertain a motion if somebody feels comfortable going there right out of the gate. But usually, because we haven't had a full commission like this on a case that's this substantial and or complicated, probably would be good for each commissioner to maybe talk about how they feel about where they want to go. And then from there, we can try to form a motion, an appropriate motion based on what we think we're thinking. And if we don't agree, then we can still have a motion and a second and vote. So, Mr. Macbeth, in my linear world, and the doctor on the commission, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, it's pretty clear to me that we currently don't understand the science around this long-term M3 metabolite. And, part of the problem here is it's very likely we will never understand it, and that we will not be able to perform excretion studies, as Dr. Eichner said, and it's unethical. That said, I believe it is, very incumbent upon us to ensure that unarmed combatants fighting in the state of Nevada are not using performing-enhancing drugs and gaining an advantage that could be dangerous, even fatal to another fighter. And so, at this point in time, for me, Mr. Jones, this is a second anti-doping policy violation that you have. And for me, I need significant amount of certainty that there's not re-administration going on, intentional or unintentional, to ensure the integrity of our testing process. So I'll hold future comments.
Okay, Commissioner Hahn?
I agree with the doctor, and I think, we've heard a lot of good testimony today. Clearly, we're in uncharted waters on multiple fronts here, which causes us to be challenged on many levels. I think what resonated with me was the double jeopardy. I think that, in the court of law, double jeopardy, it isn't allowed, and I think he's been punished once. But then, and the multiple tests since then, but how do we assure going forward? So I have some of the same issues that Dr. Macbeth has on what type, and I know Mr. Jones has agreed to, and he has been, multiple testing. Anyone can test them anytime and do whatever they want, which I think is probably a path that we need to pursue. But the double jeopardy really resonated with me, but I'm very concerned, and we don't want anyone to get hurt. I think to sidebar here, one of the things Director Bennett does so well is in matchmaking. We don't want anyone to get hurt here, and we want fighters fairly matched. And if there's any drugs involved, then anything that he's done in his vetting kind of goes out the window. And God forbid anyone gets hurt here, because I know that Bennett takes it seriously, as do all the commissioners. But some of the same issues: how do we enforce, and how do we make sure that Mr. Jones is properly tested going forward?
Thank you. Commissioner Alonso.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, we've heard many times today and previously there's no evidence of re-ingestion. What I believe is there's no evidence that he didn't. There's expert opinion, but there's no evidence due to the nature of the illegal substance and the lack of research that's been done because it's banned. which I think puts our commission in a situation where we recognize this is a technical issue. We have to rely on our experts in effort to decide what to do. I'm concerned that there's not 100% certainty at any time in our future, even if we have increased testing and the testing continues to be adverse. You know, obviously the last 4 out of 5 tests in the last 60 days, including the 2 BADA tests in January, there are adverse findings. That I don't believe there's anything that can give us the 100% certainty that there's not something that's being done, because it just continues to appear. With that, I do really value the time and expertise of Dr. Eigner and the information you provided us today. I think that I'm really just still processing, as we sit here right now, I'm processing it all on how to, in an effort to find a way to move forward, whatever that may look like. I'm not prepared to be the leader in the motion at this moment.
Okay. Commissioner Hall?
I think all the commissioners have certainly well stated what they feel and where we are, John, with this thing. I mean, you know, the thing that I'm concerned is there's a precedent. You know, should we acknowledge and issue a license? We are really subservient to Dr. Eigner and his professionalism, because I mean, this is where we have to turn. You know, these are the guys that, they are the professionals. They are the ones that guide us and provide us the information we need to make the proper decisions. And I would think if we go forward, then I think multiple testing will be involved, and to the point that we can feel comfortable that we've done the right thing for the integrity of the sport and the right thing for the athlete involved, who's paid a steep fine already, major. I would like to think, John, you're smart enough to know that you wouldn't jeopardize that again. I'd like to think that. But we have others that, you know, are going to come before the commission with very similar situations. We know the first time it's easy for us to decide because they broke the rules. Then after that, where do we go? So it is a major decision, and I think there's some things that we need to discuss in terms of going forward, where we deal with you personally in terms of your commitment to making sure that people understand not only you're clean, but you're willing to do whatever it takes to be an MMA champion and lead this group, because there are so many people that follow you, John. I'm talking about the young guys, the young kids, the guys that count. And, you know, you can be certainly a great factor and a superhero to them for a guy who understands he made a mistake once, he's not going to make it again, and try to get better.
Okay. I appreciate everybody's comments. And I concur with a couple of the things, if not all of them, that were said. You know, you could, in a sincere way, look at this as a case of double jeopardy. I kind of look at everything, and that was why I asked the questions prior to August 9th, 2018. All of that testing for me, while it's relevant and the passport that's been developed is very strong, it's really irrelevant in my thought process going forward. So the question that's before us today is, should Jon Jones get a license in the state of Nevada to fight for a March event and or thereafter? And we have right now from very accredited places up to and including a test, I believe, from the third, is it the third, Mr. Bennett, and the fourth?
The sixth and seventh,
sorry. So we have other tests from the 6th and the 7th, and I'm really going to point very strongly to Dr. Eigner's testimony and my comments here, because he knows how much we respect him, and he deserves all that respect, because, you know, to say it the right way, he is the man when it comes to this. It appears to me that we can, with a high degree of certainty, move forward with any athlete if the M3 metabolite is what's showing up and the testing frequency, it is a minimum of twice a month, potentially even 4 times a month. If I was testing an athlete, what I heard was that the parent and the short term is about 1 month. Those are not what's showing up here. The longer term is showing up. So he's been tested. The longest he has not been tested since August 9th of 2018 is 1 month and 3 days, of which, according to the science that we do know, it would have been highly likely that the original compound or the short term would have showed up. So as I look at that, that's it's approximately at this point, what, 5 months. And the testimony that I also heard was that post the last ingestion of a 6-week cycle, you're looking at about 60 days of potential residual benefit. So if I do the math and we stay in the picogram level between now and his fight, that's about 7 months of testing on a minimum of a 30-day basis, and sometimes we're looking at weeks and or days in between testing. So I would feel confident that the athlete has, Mr. Jones, if he continues to stay in the picogram level up to fight night, would have no residual benefit from whatever he ingested, however long ago he ingested it. And we're not, and then to couple that with, because it's been so frequent from his original adjudication, you know, that's where the double jeopardy thing kicks in here. And it's really based on Dr. Eichner's testimony. That's separate from opening Pandora's box. So I'm going to stop there with saying I would be comfortable departing slightly from our regulation as it pertains to this athlete on a very regimented testing program, let's say every 2 weeks at a minimum. We would need to work out the details because he's already, he's peeing in somebody's cup quite frequently, and I don't know if we need to add a 3rd cup, if we need to add Nevada's, you know, obviously Nevada can come in and test whatever we want. We do that all over the world and people don't even know about that with randomness. That all of the test results out there that are happening, whether it's with VADA, USADA, and or random, are immediately shared with this athletic commission. I'm talking within the moment it's noticed, so we have full knowledge of what's going on. If we want to move forward, I think the only way to move forward with this is with that testing, using history to August 9th of 18. The rest of it, to me, with that 10-month gap, it's just too great. So you have to look at it for the 7 months that we would have it, and if it stays at the picogram level, you know, call it, you know, under 100, you know, as it's bouncing around. My biggest concern is that there is no performance enhancing effect. And I don't look at this as a license that's for a year. I look at this as it's a 1-fight license for right now. It's a 1-fight license. Post that fight, this level of testing will continue. And it needs to continue for probably at least all of 2019 to monitor it and to study it and to have additional hearings on it and to have additional dialogue and discussions on it. I think that based on what we've heard, that's fair. It's a departure. Now, let me stop there and go to Pandora's box of all other fighters. That was some really good testimony from Mr. Eichner and from Mr. Cook, in the sense that I was having a lot of trouble about breaking out of the norm for this. But I think the approach that was put on this, the approach that was testified to, is an interesting way to look at it and not one that I had contemplated. If another fighter comes in here with their first M3 metabolite test, we're not having a hearing like this. It's going straight to the process that they all go to, because that is the first ingestion that we have knowledge of, and the process would be the same as it has always been. However, for this particular drug and this particular metabolite, after the fighter's original adjudication for the original ingestion, they would have the ability to get on a program like this, and after a lengthy period of time, potentially have a discussion about they are in this same pulsing and residual effect. If you think about that period that a fighter would have to go through, I hope a whole bunch of fighters haven't run out there and started doing this, because you're probably going to be sitting out at least 2 years before you're going to be able to come back in here and get a license if we wanted to acknowledge pulsing. That is much different than the TUEs that were brought to us back in the day 5 to 8 years ago. Those are two completely different issues, and I'm not as concerned about Pandora's box as I was walking in here this morning. So that's my comments on what I've heard today, and I think that if we did go down this path for the one fight license, you know, other jurisdictions are going to do what other jurisdictions are going to do. What I don't think we should do today, if the commission chooses that they do not want to do that, I would absolutely not be in support of denying him his license. I don't see anything here that says we should deny this man the right to earn a living. What he's going through, California and other jurisdictions may feel more comfortable than we do in monitoring this. And I don't see anything here that supports an outright rejection of the license, and because the reciprocity will kick in and other commissions usually respect one another. So I'm comfortable at this point that we have gone through the longest hearing that I've had in 4 years here and understood this information, but that doesn't, I'm one of 5. So I would throw that out to you guys to consider, you know, the one fight license. We have to have a period of testing that runs with the testimony from Dr. Eichner that makes us feel comfortable that re-ingestion is basically not possible. It's impossible. The test results are immediate, reported to us, and I don't care where you go fight. It's got to be, if you go to Russia, I want those test results. They have to continue to be submitted to Nevada no matter where you are, so we can monitor this. Because it will be critical to the next fight that he wants to fight here if he wants to get a license again. And after we've understood this for 2019, then we can sit down and decide if further testing is required at this level. Because remember, if we do this too, you're going to put the athlete under a tremendous amount of scrutiny. He's going to live with a lab coat for quite a while, of which he's volunteered, and I commend him for that, because that's not fun. So then I think that's a huge step forward in him wanting to move forward. So I would turn it over to you guys, and I'm totally open to rejection. As a matter of fact, I'm quite used to it. It frequently happens. So it won't hurt my feelings, but I think it's important that if you have things that you don't agree with that, or if I didn't have things that you all agree with, I would be saying it's important that happens up here.
I would just say going forward, it's just critical that we're able to determine with that level of certainty that there is no re-ingestion or re-administration of the Turinabol. And based off of Dr. Eichner's testimony around the short-term metabolites in the 2-week range, I agree with the chairman's suggestion that a minimum would be twice a month, and ongoing into the future, all of 19 would be a very reasonable time frame for me.
I also support that what we are considering today is a one fight additional license. I don't think that I came in here today thinking that this could turn into a disciplinary topic or potentially a ban or refusal. Chairman, as you recommended, I do support and agree that our conversation may now move into a one fight additional license motion consideration.
I would be supportive of that, and John, I think one of the areas that I think this would provide help is that if you're tested, obviously more frequently, like the chairman's suggesting. It provides people like Dr. Eisner and them a chance to analyze this and see where it's going. I mean, what it does, you know, to athletes, and to get a better idea of where it is, so we in athletics can monitor. I mean, so you're representing not only just yourself, but another field for people to see where it is, because we're saying that you haven't ingested. We're saying that you are sincere about wanting to be a supreme MMA athlete, which you are. You want to remain a champion, and champions lead, they don't follow. So now we're asking you to lead not only in the ring, but also as a guy who's going to test more than the normal person is going to test. So these people, the experts, can enlighten us more and more as we move forward with the anti-doping program.
Mr. Chairman, I'd make a motion that we approve.
Hold on before you do that. Then it seems like we're all concur that the one fight license is an appropriate place to start. What we need to be crystal clear on are what are the conditions. And so the conditions that I've heard today are two tests a month. Right. So minimum, exactly. So I think that it would be a 2 tests a month minimum. That needs to be administered by USADA. It needs to be immediately reported. We need full disclosure on all VADA tests. And the Nevada Athletic Commission Executive Director Bennett will absolutely do its own random and unannounced tests anywhere in the world at any time. Mr. Bennett?
Very good, sir.
Okay. So that would be the 3 conditions of testing. So there's 3 different agencies that would be doing that. So we would get to the one fight license. Is the date March the 2nd? Is that correct?
Yes.
So that fight would happen if under this motion. Post that fight, okay, the next condition is that you would continue with this. If you do not continue with this through 2019, then you're probably not going to get another license here. I wouldn't say that because that's a separate hearing, but I would strongly advise the applicant that we need this testing for a year to understand it. And then I can't really project a motion or any other conditions post that. I think we have to let, if the testing continues to happen, we'll continue to monitor. You will make your choices of jurisdiction that you go fight to. However, that information needs to come to us. And when Mr. Jones chooses to come back here a second time, because of course he's going to want to fight in the fight capital of the world, we will take the information at that time that we've been given, and if required, we will have another hearing. And probably a much shorter hearing on that, but we will probably have Dr. Eichner and Mr. Cook again come back in and give us that information, and we'll reconsider that again. So that would be, to be really clear on the motion, it would be a one fight license, 2 tests a month for all of 2019, up to the fight and post the fight, all of 2019, by USADA, VADA, and the Nevada Athletic Commission. And all of those tests by those agencies would be given immediately to the Nevada Athletic Commission. And that's really it. I don't need to think about it much past that because it's really only good till March the 2nd. Do you have something to add, sir? Because you look like you're about ready to jump over that microphone.
Well, I just want to make sure, before when you were deliberating, you mentioned having a level of results that would be acceptable if it went over a certain level. Do you want to put that in the condition as well?
That's a tough one, and I
think you have to consider it individually. Each test result individually.
So with that,
let me. This is highly unusual, but Dr. Eichner, could you please come back up to the microphone? Mr. Jones, you don't have to move. You keep that's fine. Dr. Eichner, is it possible that you could give us a range, picogram levels or nanogram levels, that if we see the M3 metabolite show up between now and March the 2nd, that we should have pause for concern that there's been re-administration?
Mr. Chairman, my strong recommendation would be that you look at the totality of the data, make a determination as opposed to giving an absolute threshold for any individual analyte. I premise that, but on the side, if there was evidence of other metabolites or the parent compound, that would be a different discussion, but my strong recommendation would be you look at the data longitudinally and make that decision.
If there are other metabolites or different compound, I would assume that's going to ride with past practice, and it would be, based on what it is, most likely though a temporary suspension. This is not a waiver for any and all metabolite. This is a waiver for the M3 metabolite as it pertains strictly to the oral turinabol and that direct connection. Anything else is not in this motion. What I'm trying to get to is, I guess what I'm hearing you say is if we see a spike in the nanograms between now and this fight, that we're going to have to get on the phone with you, and we're going to have to discuss these results and what they potentially may mean, like we have done many, many a times.
That would definitely be my recommendation, sir.
Okay, I can only do that if the testing results. I would only support that if the testing results that are being done by VADA and by USADA are immediately given to us. I don't think there would be any debate that he's in our jurisdiction at this point in time.
Mr. Jones is happy to do that. I'm not sure how much control he has personally over that, so that's my concern with that.
Totally understand. That's a discussion between USADA and the Nevada Athletic Commission.
And also the California State Athletic Commission, who's currently overseeing the VADA testing. So right now there's VADA testing that's being controlled by California. There's USADA testing being controlled by USADA, and then of course the Nevada testing that's you mentioned as well. So Mr. Jones can't control the reporting of any of those results.
Understood.
Okay. And also, just one other point, Mr. Jones cannot control whether or not he's tested twice a month or 10 times a month. It's not up to him to come and get tested. So that's the other concern that I simply raise, in that he's happy to agree to whatever conditions you make him agree to, provided that's actually the other people involved and make sure that works.
I got it.
Okay.
Let me rephrase then. Between now and March the 2nd is 1 month and a couple of days. So we will test him at our frequency at what we determine for the next 40 days. And that would give me even a higher degree, not that I don't have a high degree of confidence in USADA and VADA, but that'll make it really simple to remove those issues.
That's appreciated, Mr. Chairman. That's the simplest way to move forward.
That would be the way to craft a motion. It would be, it's a one-fight license, and for the next 40 days, he's going to be under Nevada Athletic Commission testing at least 2 times this month, up to maybe more. And I would venture to say it's going to be more. Then I think at that point, that will give us at least a month to work with USADA and VADA and understand if there's a way for us to cooperate as agencies on how we can move forward. And I'm highly confident that we can have that discussion with USADA, the UFC, and remove your client from being the issue and let the agencies work out their differences on how we communicate. I'm just making it clear to you, and you have a lot of influence over the UFC and USADA, that going forward, Mr. Jones is going to have to make it a requirement that those agencies report to Nevada. It's not up to the agency's discretion. And I ask that they please don't test how broad I think my jurisdiction is in the state of Nevada. Just cooperate and give me the information, and I'll have that discussion offline. But he needs to also support that request.
He's fully supportive of that. To the extent that we can influence that, we're happy to.
Fair. Okay, so that simplifies the motion. It's a one-fight license. He'll be heavily tested with the frequency we've discussed up until March the 2nd. And by then, Executive Director Bennett, you will have to determine with USADA, if you can, by our February meeting, how we're going to work as cooperating agencies as it pertains to this particular issue. And maybe we can report back in February, which would be prior to the fight. And then I would also include in the motion that these tests, it's probably not going to be more than 6, are going to be paid for by the applicant.
Post-fight?
No, to March the 2nd.
Correct, but post-fight, as far as the motion goes.
post-fight, it's still our intent to test all the way through 2019 and at a frequency no less than twice a year.
It would be, and if we can find a resolution with USADA, as they're already administering these tests, then I would be, we can talk about it in February as to making this an agenda item of an agreement on how the frequency is going to happen. And Mr. Nowitzki, I'm sure you can help that discussion. Is that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll get through that in February.
Yeah, and I think that just to state the obvious, whether assuming it's Smyrtle or USADA that's executing our testing, is that it's identical to how Executive Director Bennett requested the December 9th results to be expedited, because we don't have a month time frame, right? Good. So every test has to be expedited in the same way that we requested.
That's all on us at this point.
Okay.
We will control that and run those tests and control the expedition of those tests. He may be subject to other tests, and hopefully they disclose them at the pace they have been, or faster. But we will be doing that if we choose to go down this path. I think we've exhausted it. If you guys are all, if that's a path everybody would like to take. All right, then I look for a motion on that.
Move approval.
Okay, so moving for approval for one fight license, Nevada Athletic Commission testing, paid for by the applicant, up to the March 2nd event. Is that agreeable?
Yes.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great, motion passes unanimously. Okay. Mr. Jones, I appreciate you being here today. Appreciate you coming here to testify. Welcome back to the state of Nevada. If you recall, a long time ago, you and I had a conversation in your locker room when you came back to Nevada. I will reiterate what Coach said. Coach, Commissioner Alt, we call him Coach. This is on you. It's on your shoulders. I like what I hear, I like what I see, but the proof's in the pudding. So I'm happy that you're back here. You'll always be treated with respect here. And I wanted to make sure that you understood that today. Welcome back to Nevada, and do the right thing from this point going forward. And as you know, we're going to be visiting you frequently.
Thank you.
Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.